Can you hear me now? Hello?
Hello. Hi.
Yes, what's your name?
Hi there. Are you Alan?
Yes, I am.
Hi, I'm Lauren. Nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you as well. You're early, so am I, because I've been having a lot of problems connecting to New Center technology.
Ah, okay. Sorry, I think that the maybe it's slightly delayed, but I think it will be fine.
Yeah, I've been teaching with Zoom at NYU, been no problem so far. But I couldn't access my New Center account, and I couldn't access where the readings are. I've been uploaded, so.
Ah, I'm sorry to hear that. Have you been in touch with Kazra about it?
Yeah, I've been in dialogue with them. In fact, I should write them now that I'm not connected to Zoom successfully without any issues. Because I assume they were going to send the Zoom link to my New Center email account, which I haven't been able to access. So that's been resolved.
Okay, yeah, I just resent it to your. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just resent it to your NYU account, so you should be able to access it through there as well, right?
Oh, okay. So you're with the New Center.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought you were one of the students.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just the moderator of this. Yeah.
Oh, good. So then you know that I successfully connected. I assume, Lauren, that you're one of the students who had arrived early. Okay.
No, I opened the room, so to speak. No.
Yeah. So I don't know what happened. I checked into I reset my password. I tried to check into G Suite, and when I put the New Center address, it doesn't recognize it. Okay. So I was told to put the New Center /login link. I did that. It doesn't recognize it. So I don't know what's going on.
That's a bit frustrating.
And G Suite tends to recognize my existing email accounts. It recognizes me, but based on my existing accounts, not based on the New Center account. Are you in Berlin?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I live in Berlin. Yeah.
What time is it in Berlin right now?
It's about 7:45.
Wow.
Yeah.
Students go to classes this late on a Saturday night?
I mean, the classes are really global, so I think it's at different times for everyone. So,
oh, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't gotten the breakdown of the students for the seminar. I don't know who they are, or where they're from, and what their backgrounds are.
Yeah.
If someone could send that to me, I'd appreciate that, so I know who I'm talking to.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you and I can use this moment while we're here together to talk a little bit about how we usually start.
Okay.
So generally, I'll just say a hello and welcome to everyone when 8 p.m. or 2 p.m. Comes, and I'll give a little blurb, which is kind of I guess it's the abstract that you submitted for the class. I will read it out, so also if someone's watching this after the case, they know what the content is on.
Make sure they're in the class too.
Yeah, and then you can either take it over from there, or also I can lead in a kind of, I don't know if you had the idea of getting to know the students a little bit by asking for their names and pronouns, or if you'd like me to lead that, I also can, and then you could take it over from there.
Yeah, maybe you can do that. I was going to do that. I wasn't sure where to do that because I didn't want to eat up too much of the class time doing that. I was going to ask them to kind of send me a little brief paragraph by email, who they were, you know. I don't know, how do you usually do that? Do you usually do that in the Zoom site, first class?
Yeah, I think in the first class, people tend to say their names and pronouns just because it also helps people to put their voice in the room so they can feel like they can say something.
Make sure everybody's microphone is working too. Okay, fine. So yeah, you should do that.
Okay, great. So I'll lead that, and then.
My plan is to, at least for the first part of the class, for the first hour or so, you have a kind of overarching introductory lecture, and then in the second hour or so, to kind of just go over the syllabus and discuss, you know, where we're going to be, the kind of geography of the course.
Sounds great.
Where we've been going.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Are you still in semester at NYU?
Oh, we still have yet to grade, but basically the course teaching is over. Yeah. But we've been teaching intensively in Zoom and doing a lot of conferences in Zoom since March. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And are you in the university system, or are you?
Yeah, I work at Kassel University, kind of in the middle at Kassel University.
Or Hassel.
Yeah, and like it's well known for Documenta, but I work.
Yeah,
yeah.
Connected to Documenta, yeah. So you in an art program or?
No, I work in the Gender and Diversity and Informatics Systems. It's within the electrotechnical department in Kassel. Yeah, so I work on an interdisciplinary research project there.
Are you taking courses too there, or just working as a researcher?
I work as a researcher.
Yeah. What's your project?
It's called Recoding Algorithmic Culture. It's a VW grant. And we work on, it's in between the sociology of diversity, the art school, and the information technology department. It's a new project. We've been working on kind of understanding disciplinary bounds so far. So we do research in labs together. And I currently work on a lot of critical pedagogy within socio-technical practices. So that's what my work is focused on. Yeah.
Like, if you've written anything, I'd love to read some of that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to send you some things.
I just published a piece on drone warfare, which was the attempt to develop a kind of critical lexicon of algorithmic war and governmentality, because obviously existing vocabulary is inadequate, you know. Yeah. I saw some of what you're doing when you mean by recoding.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was, the grant was not something that I was, the title was decided before I came to it, I guess is what to say. So now we have the name. And I think that the question of what recoding means is an ongoing question. It's interesting how within sociological practices, the idea of recoding or coding something as a theory-making practice has a very different implication than it does within the information sciences. So I think that that's the where it came from, of this notion of coding or recoding, but how it applies to, within information tech is, I think, a different question. So,
yeah, but at the same time, there's a kind of cultural reception or mediation of algorithmic coding that can be examined. You know, is that the dominant forms of interpretation or representation or framing of coding practices, you know, acceptable, you know. So for example, the work of someone like Simone Brown, you know, on facial recognition, you know, the racial bias and facial recognition programs and things like that. Yeah. How are you approaching the issue of diversity and recoding?
I would like to answer your question, but I need to just do a technical thing real quick. So just give me a sec, okay? Hey, Castro.
Yeah, someone else is coming on too. A student, I assume. Go on. Says we're live on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
Is that for public access, or just you have to have a special password to get in?
Just a sec. Sorry, Alan. I just need to finish this.
No, all right, I'll let you do your thing.
Sorry. Okay, I'm back. Is Kazra still here? So he was
Yeah, I'm still here.
okay, very good.
No, I was just asking, it says live on YouTube. So is that a public access, or is it coded, is it encrypted?
It's public access right now. Would you
So
prefer
people,
to go live?
so people can see me teaching right now?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I knew it was being recorded. Can it be, does it have to be go on public?
I can check real quick to see what the rules are about that. I'm not familiar with exactly.
I don't understand the point. Why would anybody register for your courses if they could access it simultaneously on YouTube?
I think that it's because you can't like participate in the class, right? But let me check.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yeah. I knew they were being recorded, but to go publicly on YouTube at this point, well.
I'm just checking in about it. Khosrow just says that they started going live after the pandemic on YouTube so that people could access the class and teaching. So people can enroll more. That's what he said.
Mm. Okay. And no other instructors have objected to that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I am only moderating your course, so I don't know.
Right. No, I'm just, I'm getting, information in bits and pieces. Yeah, well, I guess you consider it a form of public relations.
Yeah, we can also go offline if you're not happy with it.
I would prefer that at this point, yeah.
Yeah, okay, let's turn it off then.
Yeah. Because first of all, I was told you were recording, but I thought that was going to be for and I was told that would be for selective, use, right, but I didn't know that these could go online. simultaneous. You know?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I haven't moderated a course since before the pandemic, so I didn't know that that was how it was either. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, if we could take it offline, that'd be great.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, we're offline now.
And you can still record it. You can record it, and then we can discuss what to use of it.
Okay.
I believe in whether it's writing or visual. I'm an expert in visual culture, so when it's writing or edit or anything else, I always believe in editing. Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. It's important to have these discussions beforehand.
Yeah. And since there's no contract, yeah, I asked if there was a contract. They said there wasn't any. So I hope Mo was not offended.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yes, we can. Eric Meier, we can hear you. He disappeared again. And there's Eric. Okay.
Hello. Hey, Eric, are you there?
And
Hi,
Ali,
can you hear me?
Hey.
Eric, yeah, we can hear you.
Hi.
I see you.
Perfect. So the problem was for some reason, I only got the audit link and not the participant link. And yeah, it would be cool if you can fix this for next time. But I mean,
Okay.
we made it here, so. So.
All right,
What was the link you got initially? An
What?
audit link. Oh, an audit link?
Yeah, I only got the audit link, which like just for guests from the news center. But at least I want to look into the seminar and maybe participate. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Eric.
Yeah.
I will double check to see
Okay. Yeah.
what's up with that.
Now I'm here, so everything went fine.
Okay. Okay, very good.
We also have Aliakse.
Yeah, I just messaged them and they said that they'll be right back. So,
Yeah.
there. Okay.
Yeah.
So Eric, you're not officially registered yet. Is it just you're still thinking about whether or not to join the course?
Yes, basically, I think. Yeah. So I'm also like moderating, like for the technical stuff, another course, and as far as I know, one can basically say, yeah, I want to participate, and then the questions, okay, do people actually show up or do they not show up, and then this plays out a little bit, and yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how that works with Zoom. I know in real life it can be a nuisance because you develop a group sense and then people stop coming because of auditing because they don't feel obligated to attend, you know. So I always insist that if you're going to, if news center is permitting audits, that's fine. I just like the audits to be consistently present, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm strict about adhering to the readings. So audits have to be doing the readings as much as the registered students.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alan, can I ask Eric a question real quick?
Yeah.
Eric, can you please tell me if you're also doing this, I wonder if you could help me make sure that there's not other people that are having the same problem.
Yeah. So the best method is to open the chat tab.
Okay.
And then there is a little, then you should be able to see participants. Maybe there is a little arrow on the left upper corner of the chat tab.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah. And then you have basically participants, like which displays the panelists, and the audit people who only watch this. And if you see, okay, there are a lot of people who are auditing this, who actually registered as panelists, then you can click on their names and choose promote to panelists.
Yeah.
And this is the easiest way. Yeah.
Got it. Very good.
Okay.
I'm trying to single out individual panelists, but it doesn't give me that choice. I guess I only have the choice all panelists and attendees. So I can't, like, I wanted to say greet Alexei, but I couldn't do it.
I see.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's working now. Thank you for the little walkthrough.
Okay. No problem. I was nervous as heck when I did this the first time.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because all kinds of people start messaging you. You are nervous as well, and then I need,
Yeah.
let me do this.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. All right, well, I'll just keep my eye on who's in the participants list in case anyone else tries to join with the other link, and I'll promote them.
Yeah.
Is there any way to get individual to be able to chat with individual participants? I don't see, because I've been using Zoom other, you see the individual names and the group names, but I'm not only getting the group names.
As far as I understand it, the chat at the bottom, you can choose who you send messages to. So
yeah, I know, but I'm not seeing that alternative here. I'm seeing all panelists, two alternatives, all panelists and attendees. I'll try it again.
Okay, I can also see.
I'm also back in a minute.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I can see if there's a setting on my end that I could update.
I'm not getting the individual. I'm usually, once they get online, I should be able to get the individual names of panelists. They should be able, to privately connect to me.
Yeah. Alan, if it's okay with you, if I'm not able to figure it out, I will be in touch about it so we can fix it for the next time.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I don't know right now. Okay, shall we wait for a few minutes or shall we begin since it's time?
How many students we have registered? I was told it was 15.
Yeah, I think there's 16 now, one more person. But we're 11 people, so
Yeah.
now we're 12. Yeah. Maybe we wait another minute or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rush. I don't suppose I have a class they're going to after this one.
It depends on where you are, I suppose.
Mm. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I only see 11 on my, or 10 actually, so far on my gallery view.
There's now 13 people. It might be that some people are just still logging in.
Yeah. Let me see if I get, okay, yeah, there's more. There's Sebastjan, it's coming in.
Hello.
Hello.
Greeting, Sebastjan. We're just waiting, if people can hear me, Alan Feldman here. We're just waiting for, I think, 2 more people based on the registration. So give us another minute. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think it's 10, Alan.
8, 9, 10. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and do your introduction?
Do my little start. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the first session of Guarding the Border on the Technological Threshold of Human and Unhuman. So to begin, I'll read a little description from the course. Today's war on terror, refugees, migrant labor, minorities, and the immunocompromised mediate what counts and does not count as human. This process is activated through images of humanity's alters and antagonists, all those bodies which lack humanity and consequently define the human through excommunication. The monstrous, grotesque, and the unhuman political technologies cannot mask and distort a determining political reality lying behind such images, but are in themselves formative and structuring forces by which an order and disorder of bodies are crafted in acts of political speciation. In this seminar, we will engage the core concepts and methods of a materialist media archeology of the body as a counter-history of the present. We will retrieve the submerged layers of sensory and spatio-temporal practice embedded in the biopolitical body and its technological unconscious. So our fearless leader in this is Alan Feldman. Alan Feldman is a professor of media culture and communication at the NYU at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. And to begin today, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lauren. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm in Berlin. And I'd like to invite everyone else to say your name, your pronoun, and where you're coming from today. So I can call on you, or we can go around as you wish. Maybe it's easiest for me to just call on you to get started. So in my list, Jonathan is first.
Hi, my name's Jonathan. So he, they, them, I'm fine with either. Right now I'm in Richmond, Virginia. Should I introduce myself?
Yes, yes, please do, Jonathan. A little bit of your
Okay.
background, the work you do.
I'm a visual artist, mostly working with photography and emerging technology. I'm also an educator. I'm assistant professor of photography and digital features at Virginia Commonwealth University. So I'm very interested in this class just through that sort of framework of technology, kind of imaging regimes, their kind of ethics, morality, etc. And I'm also right now in the structuring a class on deepfakes. So I'm taking this class kind of in tandem with Ressa's class on demonology, sort of kind of working through some of my thoughts in that class. And then also I have a couple of writing projects that I'm interested in kind of developing using some of the readings that you have on the syllabus.
Okay. What was that class you were developing before you mentioned demonology?
It's a class called Deepfake Ethics. So it's looking,
Fake
yeah,
ethics.
so it's looking at the, this sort of trend of algorithmic sort of manipulation of moving image works to make,
okay.
To make these very sort of seamless, convincing videos.
Yeah, okay. Counterfeiting, yes, I understand. Okay, thank you very much.
The next
Who's
person
next?
is
Yeah.
Alex Cruz.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Alex Cruz. I live in Oakland, California. I'm a writer and artist. I'm working primarily in poetry, video, and performance. And one facet of my practice concerns the formation and articulation of ontological categories of human and non-human, particularly with regard to machinic intelligence and relationality, which drew me to this course. So yeah, it's great to be here and good to see you all. Thanks.
The next person on my list is Alaski. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Hi, is it me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello. My name is Alexei.
Alexei, thank you.
I'm from Belarus. I really wanted to take this course because during my master's, I've taken a lot of courses on post-colonial theory and decolonial theory, and I like how this course sort of combines this theoretical framework with technological, and also how it addresses the border as like a physical, basically, separation, but also this this layer of subject as how the body is performed, how this can be sort of exclusion. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Next is Andrew.
Hi, so I'm Andrew, my pronouns are he and him. I'm coming to you from London, but originally from Australia. So my background's in architecture, but more recently I've been doing, I guess, artistic research along the lines of logistical labor, as well as environmental media, and how representations of the environment can mediate between different epistemologies. So I'm interested primarily in the, I guess, I have a particular interest in the spatial aspect of this course, as well as the ethics of media. This kind of thing. Thanks.
Thanks. The next person on my list is Chantal.
My name is Chantal. I'm based in Vienna at the moment, and you can refer to me as she and her. I've just started my master in history of art, so I'm kind of trying to use this as digging into more theory because I'm very interested in questions raised by discourse such as the body, the performativity of the body, the mediatization, and how it all plays together with yeah, the human body and borders in general.
Thanks. The next person is Ekin.
Good afternoon. My name is Ekin. Hello, Alan. We are a bit familiar with one another.
Hey.
I know you. I'm based in New York City. I'm from Istanbul. Pronouns he, him, they, and fine. My interests in this class and in Professor Feldman's wider body of literature is, I think he's one of the more interesting thinkers of mediology today that's working, beginning as the syllabus sort of determines, Hegel is the thinker of externalizing prosthesis vis-a-vis this positive reflection, external reflection, determining reflection. And I am working on a project, a very long project of self-relation as reference to other through media and through meta language as mediation. So that's me, yes.
Thank you. And then, sorry?
Go on, Lauren, sorry.
Yeah, okay, sorry. The next person on the list for me is Eric.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Eric. My pronouns are he, him. I'm based in Germany in a small town called Bad Salzuflen, and you don't need to know that. I study sociology and philosophy, and in Bielefeld, also not so small, but yeah. And my core interests circle around the relation of fundamental philosophical questions to fundamental questions of the social, of the political, and recently, since a few years, I've started to getting into accelerationism and the question of the relation of the human and technology, the border between that, and yeah, this is what drove me to this class.
Thanks. The next person is Sebastjan.
Hey, I'm Sebastjan. I'm currently doing my MA in curatorial and critical studies in Frankfurt, Germany. I'm going to be writing my MA thesis on opacity and illegibility in contemporary art. And what attracted me to this course was, of course, the very relevance of the topics dealing with the distinction between human and the non-human, and how this is also connected to certain Afro-pessimist discourses, perhaps, and also, of course, how this feeds back into visuality and visual aspects, and how such distinctions get visualized. Yeah.
Thank you. The next person on my list is Shilpy.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I'm Shilpy Lather, and I'm based in New Delhi, India. I'm a communication designer, illustrator, and an animation artist, working in the fields of menstrual hygiene management, maternal and child health, type 1 diabetes in underprivileged children. Currently, the project that I'm working on is about domestic abuse.
Thank you, Shilpy. And the next person on my list is William.
Hi, I'm Will Hallett. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm based in Maine. That's like the northeasternmost state of the United States. And I've been in New York City for a few years and have come up here in the past few months since COVID started. And let's see, I got a BA in English Lit and a master's in computer art. I've read a bit and like written a little bit on borders. My like primary source in those endeavors has been Ashit Mbembe's recent talks on borders in the age of networks. And generally I've taken on a like I've tried to think through like contemporary ideas of trauma as a way of sort of thinking about borders in the age of networks. And then in general, I'm interested in transdisciplinary studies and, you know, mixes of theory and practice. Yeah.
Thanks. The next person on my list is Zay. Are they here?
I'm Zé Antonio. I'm finishing my PhD now in legal theory at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm speaking from the very south of Brazil, and my whole trajectory has, like, since my master's already some connection to the themes of this course, I guess. My master's was about Derrida's treatment of law. I had already like started working also with Agamben a bit and like the whole biopolitical discussion. And in my PhD, I'm focusing on media and technology as an object of studies, like an immediate object of studies for legal theory. So thinking about this like technical nomos, like platform sovereignty, platform governmentality, and also the anthropological implications of those contemporary transitions. So I guess this is going to help me go a little bit deeper in this like anthropological, legal, technical connection.
Thank you.
Is there anything else? Okay.
Oh no, I think just a little introduction is good. And then the last person I have on my list is, forgive me for the pronunciation, is Zhao Yao. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey. Hi.
Oh wait, sorry. Everything was turned off. Hi. I'm Xiao Yao. That was quite good. And I'm based in Germany at the moment. I did a bachelor in economics in Heidelberg in the south of Germany, and then a master's in cultural economics in Rotterdam. So, and then I've been involved in the more independent art scene, let's say in the Netherlands and Amsterdam, and then lately in Beijing and New York as well, yeah.
Cool. Okay, I think that that's everyone. So thank you all for the introduction. And one thing I want to offer in this space before I hand it over back to Alan is that in digital spaces like this, I think that sometimes people feel very comfortable speaking and so other people don't. So one thing that I like to offer as a facilitation is to practice step up, step up. So if you're someone that likes to speak a lot, step up by giving space to other people. And if you're someone that likes to not speak up so much, step up and share your thoughts. So with that, I'll let Alan take it away.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Thank you for your facilitation. I'm Alan Feldman. My pronouns are he and him. I'm also from New York, and we tend to speak English very fast. So if I do that, please tell me to slow down. Because a lot of times the way I lecture is through improvisation, and sometimes my speech is faster than my thought process is faster than my speech, or vice versa. What a very interesting group of people, and I think one of the first classes I've had in a long while, where I want to read about everybody's projects right now. You know, and I could really think of a class where everybody begins presenting on their projects, and maybe we have to program that in. I mean, your existing projects, which may change or be altered as a result of the course. I hope so. My own training, since everybody has been talking about their background, is I have a joint training in political cultural anthropology, medical anthropology, as well as continental philosophy. As an undergraduate at the New School, I took classes under Hannah Arendt and Hans Jonas and Aaron Gervich, who come out respectively out of the Heideggerian and Husserlian phenomenological tradition, with the exception of Arendt, though they studied under Heidegger, never claimed any influences, though that's debatable. And then when I returned to graduate school after a break, I was studied under Stanley Diamond in the first Marxist anthropology department in the United States, which was very much focused on the interaction between anthropology and philosophy. And also under Rainer Sherman, who I consider to be probably the greatest Heideggerian commentator of the 20th and 21st century, maybe equal to Derrida. He was a very big influence on my work. And I guess to describe my work, as I tend to philosophize ethnography, and I try to ethnographicize philosophy. And this will come out in this course to a great degree. My own work has been focused on political violence, which basically precipitated my interest in the conditions of embodiment and the political organization of the human sensorium. When my first field project as a doctoral student was in Northern Ireland during the insurgency and counterinsurgency there. And I ended up working with people who were in various paramilitary organizations, both Republican, Irish, and Protestant loyalist organizations, and also with political prisoners who had been recently released who had participated in the Republican dirt protests and later on the Republican hunger strikes, in which 10 people died. So one of the gaps in political theory and even anthropological theory at that time when I started doing my work was the absence of material dimensions of violence, the absence of the body. There was a tendency to read political conflicts, violent political conflicts, from the point of view solely of the formalized political adversarial ideologies of each of the different belligerent groups. And yet what I was seeing in my fieldwork experience was an increase, as violence intensified and escalated, an increasing gap between what Lacan would call the symbolic and the real, in the sense that the symbolic here would be the official ideological discourses and lexicons being deployed by different political groups, the Irish Republicans, the British government, Protestant paramilitaries, and the actual on-the-ground experiential reality, which was very much connected to the experience of the body, which I would call the real, in the sense that in the Lacanian tradition, the real is always that which resists, which cannot be represented, cannot be totalized through representation, resist representation. And usually the real in Lacanian theory is the surplus excess that's actually produced by the kind of disavowals, the closures, the kind of structural blindness and occlusion of official political ideology. For example, more recently in my work on the war on terror, the whole relationship between the kind of justifications for going to war against so-called Islamic fascism, you know, what was used to justify it, and the actual driving modalities, which are premised on disavowal and denial of the full consequences of violence under the title collateral damage. After my work in Northern Ireland, I produced a book called Formations of Violence, the narrative of the body and political terror in Northern Ireland, which was a first, in the sense it was the first book by an anthropologist who was actually working in a conflict zone while that zone was still conflict was still underway and killings and bombings were still taking place. And also it was the first, I think the first anthropological attempt to systematically apply the work of Foucault on the body to a specific historical, socio-cultural, empirical situation. Though one caveat here, and we'll be talking about this later on, is that Foucault really wrote about political violence. He did much more in his lectures and his published work. He tended to have a very interesting relationship to the actual dimension of transactional violence. One could say that maybe Foucault did focus on structural violence, but tended to avoid describing transactional violence. And even in a book like Discipline and Punish, which a lot of people still write as if it's about violence, there's only one chapter on violence, which is the execution of what's his name, the guy who tried to kill the king. And the rest of the book is really does not talk about interactional embodied violence in the Panopticon. So after publishing that book, the course of that work, I was invited to teach in South Africa in the mid-1990s, where my students told me that I was teaching at the University of Cape Town, basically invited me to come back and work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I did from 1996 to 2000, off and on, taking frequent trips to South Africa, attending the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is basically an investigative body looking at human rights violations by both the apartheid state and also the anti-apartheid organizations like the ANC or the Pan-African Congress. And I also ended up working with people who performed as witnesses in the hearings, and basically went back to their communities to do ethnographic research with them. And then I'm also working with Isangomas, which are ritual healers in South Africa, to get their perspective on the violence, which was trying to move past a Eurocentric, rationalist, Christian perspective, which dominated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Around the same time that I was doing that work in South Africa, in New York City, because I was not in a research institution, I was in an institute, a public health institute. I began working on HIV/AIDS prevention and basically designing harm reduction intervention programs with the homeless in New York City who were affected and infected by HIV. Many of whom were substance misusers, and also focusing on the policing of HIV subjects, the policing of compromised immune systems by the New York City police and homeless various city agencies, which I argued in my work ended up accelerating the transmission of HIV across homeless communities and in between homeless or housed and unhoused communities as well, because unhoused populations are not separate or segregated from housed populations. And then in 2001, with the attack on the World Trade Center, I began working on what I call the visual culture of the war on terror. My work on visual culture also emerged in the early mid-90s when I wrote a very influential piece, which I'll have to publish. I was just celebrating its 25th anniversary, called On Cultural Anesthesia, from Desert Storm to Rodney King, which was making connections between the smart bomb, the sensory organization of smart bomb conflict in Desert Storm, Gulf War I, and the kind of video manipulation by the police who beat up Rodney King and the trial of those police officers and why they were attempting to explain why they were exonerated by the jury through this kind of manipulation of the beating, of this kind of surveillance beating of Rodney King. And that interest in visual culture continued and came to a head with the advent of the war on terror, where it was completely impossible to do a kind of ethnographic field work. So basically had to do work at a distance, and where my focus has been primarily on the intersection between the war abroad and domestic racialized violence at home. And in many ways, my Rodney King essay anticipated and co-joined and was validated, thankfully, by the emerging discourse by Afro-pessimists like people like Frank Wilderson and Saidiya Hartman, among others, who have subsequently been an influence on my work, which is why racism will be a major issue in slavocracy in the course. I published several essays on the war and terror, but the culminating product of that was a book that I published in 2015, really came out, 2016, called Archives of the Insensible, which is a collection of essays on the war and terror and also on transitional justice and on humanitarian violence, which it culminates by kind of reviewing all those essays in the last chapter, which is a focus on political animality, which became a major concern of mine too, particularly in the work of Jacques Derrida, as well as in Agamben. So that's a kind of very quick summary. In terms of the course, how I see it is it's a huge topic, and there's no way to totalize it in 8 sessions, 8 2.5-hour sessions. And there's so many different developments, but I've basically the mission I've given myself is to develop a kind of tactical genealogical reading through which I see as a kind of core kind of theoretical traditions or legacies or inheritances. One can be roughly divided to the Hegelian, and post-Hegelian tradition that kind of links up with Fanon. The other, the kind of Nietzschean, Foucauldian tradition, which connects also to people like Deleuze, and of course there are readings like Klosowski that Pierre Klosowski, also very influenced by Nietzsche and a big influence on Deleuze. But these are very roughly, honed kind of theoretical schools of thought, and a lot of my work has been kind of reconciling them, putting them, showing where they interface, and not accepting the kind of tendency of continental philosophers, particularly in France, to basically claim that to work on kind of binary models of where they place their own theory, knows, as a lot of people want to talk about technology in the body, techniques in the body, techne in the body, and this has also been my concern. I just recently published an essay that I put on the syllabus on algorithmic warfare, and in which I do a media archeology, connecting it to the work of the German mystic Nicholas de Cusa, which I consider one of the earliest theorists of omnivoyant surveillance, and his work is quite interesting. We'll be looking at that essay, kind of a political theology of surveillance and connecting that to drone warfare. And where I see this course fitting in is providing the students with a critical lexicon. A lot of my work has been lexical, in the sense I've been very dissatisfied with the inherited vocabularies in the social sciences and in public culture that are used to describe violence, just as much as I was dissatisfied with the kind of official ideological rationales that organize political conflicts, at least on the level of rhetoric. And looking for other types of vocabularies that bring us, and basically, that subtitle of my first book, The Narrative of the Body, really has as its premise is what happens to history, what happens to specific historical, political, site-specific situations when you begin telling their stories from the perspective, from the level, from the dimension of embodiment and disembodiment, because you can't separate the two, particularly we're dealing with issues of violence. And as I should also say here that probably one of the things that will demarcate my perspective on theorists like Agamben, Foucault, and Hegel is the fact that I initially approached them from the perspective of trying to make sense of different forms of political conflict and political violence, from torture to genocide to counterinsurgency. And And while most of the theorists, particularly recent theorists on Hegel, people like Butler, Malabou, Pippin, Brandom, basically have little or nothing to say about the role of violence in the Hegelian tradition, which I would dispute or I think would like to supplement. What I hope to do is kind of a vocabulary or lexical building exercise where we can develop a technical vocabulary that will allow us ultimately to begin tackling issues like algorithmic governmentality and human, non-human interfaces, and organic and disorganic forms of embodiment and disembodiment. So that's kind of an overview of my perspective. What I want to do today is kind of give an introductory lecture and see how long that will take, and maybe begin connecting it to the readings, particularly Page de Bois. And here I want to mention that the other kind of interest in technology and genealogy is in relationship to slaveocracy, and the fact that in Roman slavery, slaves were identified as instrumentum vocale, which is also noted by Orlando Patterson in his book on slavery. Instrumentum vocale literally means speaking instrument, which puts the slave in relationship to technology. And I want to examine that in our readings, particularly in Hegel, in Kojève, maybe later on Frank Ruda, and in Agamben's book on the uses of the body, which is his first explicit discussion of slavery in his writings, as far as I can figure out. Because even though he writes a lot about Greek and Roman society in places like Homo Sacer, slavery is not really discussed. Slavery also tends to be absent of gap in Foucault's discussion of power knowledge apparatuses as applied to the body. So this is a kind of ongoing concern. It's an ongoing project for me, so this will be an exploratory dimension. I hope I can explore alongside you, with you and your perspectives. So I would give this introductory lecture, and then in the time, take some questions, and in the time remaining, kind of just review the syllabus with you, if that's all right. We may run out of time, and apologies ahead of time. I should also say that in the syllabus readings, I tend to give more readings than we can possibly cover during the duration of the course, because I want the syllabus to be a resource for you, not just for this course, but for the future. So I tend to, as we get into dialogue, I'll ask you to put up some readings into the syllabus that students can look at. And I also, as you ask questions and converse with me and with each other, that will give me other ideas from the syllabus. I just finished teaching a course on borders called Space, Place, and Border Politics at another class. And I know here that there are people interested in the border as a spatial, topological, topographic construct, which is not that explicit in the set of readings I have put up, because I'm mainly interested in between the border of the human and non-human, the human and the animal, the human and the monstrous. But certainly there's relevance there that we can bring in to play in our discussions. Okay, so that's the introductory statement. I should say one thing about classroom methodology and protocol, since Lauren already mentioned the issue about giving people their turn taking online. The students in the class, the scholars in the class, strike me as folks who've done a lot of very interesting, eclectic reading that we may not all share in common. And what I would urge you to do is basically, at least for the first half of the term, to begin limiting your discussions and comments to the readings at hand. My teacher, Rainer Sherman, was very strict about this, and I've tended to, and so was Hannah Arendt, and I tend to follow their precedent, in the sense that Rainer, if he assigned a text like Foucault, Archaeology of Knowledge. I remember this happened, you know, and he asked me, and I was supposed to give a presentation on that, and I began doing a comparative analysis between Foucault and Althusser. He stopped me and interrupted me. He said, first, we have to learn what the text is saying in and of itself before we compare it to another text or reduce it to another text. To a certain degree, because I'm a professor, I can commit that sin in the course, but I will try to present close readings of selected passages of all the texts that we'll be working with. And I would really appreciate it if students would also do that as well. It may not be the passages I've selected, but to come into each class with passages you have questions about, passages you agree or disagree with, passages you want to expound upon. But let's adhere, at least initially, to what's going on in the chosen selected text. Okay, so questions or comments or interventions anybody wants to make at this point? Have I been talking too fast?
No.
Okay.
Brilliant. You are perfect pace.
Okay, so what I would like to do is give an overarching introduction to the class from kind of perspective of my own work and some of the issues I've been dealing with. So I would argue that in Aristotle, Hegel, Kojève, Nietzsche, and Fanon, and to a certain degree, Foucault and Agamben, the body is presented as what I call an historiographic surface. What do I mean by that? The body is presented as a scenic container of historical time in the form of desire, memory, as a prosthetic extension of another subject, body or apparatus, and as proleptic becoming, as well as a destituent condition, as disintegrated. When we're thinking about embodiment, we always have to think about conditions of disembodiment. This is the lesson that working with violence imposes on you. You can't ignore that dimension. Foucault treated the issue of the historiographic surface through his thesis of the spatialization of history, which was his major critique or rejection of Hegel's motto, or a particular version of Hegel. And that's the problem we'll also be dealing with. There's so many different versions of Hegel that you can't say that this is a deviant or there's an authoritative version. But Foucault argued when he talked about the spatialization of power and of historical experience, that modernity was grounded in a spatial organization which encompasses the body as a volume in space, but as a volume that is that can constitute its own spatial realities or effects, and as a volume, in Nietzsche in history, as a volume, the genealogy of the body, genealogy, Nietzsche in history, that essay, as a volume in perpetual disintegration, as it passes through a variety of dispositives or power knowledges apparatuses from one to the other, like the prison, like the clinic, like the military encampment, like the school, like the convent, like the monastery. So historical temporality for Foucault was the normative effect and discourse of regional enclosures of power, of site-specific regional ontologies of the body, like the clinic, the asylum, the prison. And it's in these spaces that time itself is constructed both as a symbolic object and as an instrument of domination. And here I am kind of deviating from Foucault and putting him into interface with the work of Reinhard Koselleck, his book, Futures Past, right? Past Representations of Futures. In that book, Koselleck notes or tracks a transition in the cultural symbolic understanding of history from the French Revolution to the mid to late 19th century. And basically his argument, to be succinct, says basically in the French Revolution, the political actors envisioned themselves as acting on a stage, which is history, acting within a stage in history. And there's a very interesting a commentary by Lyotard on this, where he talks about the whole model of historical representation and writing is based on this model of the proscenium stage, which has a front space, you know, where historical events take place, a back space where the infrastructures of history are assembled. And then you have direct witnesses, those people who are sitting in the first row of the audience of the theater. And then as you move back towards the theater, you have the people who are writing commentaries or, you know, like kind of annal type accounts. And then you have the kind of critical analytical historians who are removed from the original event sitting in the back rows of the theater. And Koselleck is saying something similar, that basically historical actors in the French Revolution saw themselves as acting on a stage, which was history, acting within a kind of theatrical, scenography of history. And this was actually literal, because the French revolutionaries saw themselves as kind of reenacting Roman republicanism and Greek democracy, and actually developed clothing styles and hairstyles and artistic representations and architecture reenacted Greek and Roman aesthetics. But then Koselleck notices a shift in the kind of representation of history, starting with the emergence of revolutionary movements like 1848 and later on, where he talks about the temporalization of history. History is no longer a stage upon which people act, but an object of action, a symbolic object of political action. And that the revolutions that emerge after the Westphalian agreements, you know, and the post-Napoleonic kind of return of authoritarian aristocracies was an attempt to, according to Koselleck, to accelerate time. The revolution is about the acceleration of time, which he also calls the temporalization of history. So, and I think we find this temporalization of history in Foucault, but for Foucault, this acceleration or instrumentation of historical time, or this kind of instrumentation of time, of history as an object of action rather than as a space within which one acts, could only be possible in terms of its prior synchronic spatialization in specified sites of enclosure and competence. For Foucault, the instrumentation of historical time is coeval with the manipulation of material relations, artifacts, topologies, and surfaces that embody history as a prerequisite to its mobilization and acceleration. That is why Foucault understood his analysis of the spatialization of power as subverting the Hegelian concept of history. Now, to put that very succinctly, and we will return to this and maybe even question this in subsequent discussions, according to Foucault, for Hegel, history is basically generated through the negation of space, of res extensa, of materialities extended in space by temporal becoming, the negation of space by time. And you can see that very quite explicitly in the Marxist connection to Hegelian theory, where labor practice, which is the production of cultural, social, human artifacts out of nature, as discussed in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, are described exactly that way by Marx as a negation of materiality of nature, i.e. of space, by temporal activity, i.e. the process of embodied labor production. And this notion of history as negation of space by temporal becoming, temporal transformation, by time, is inverted by Foucault to produce what I call this problematic of the historiographic surface in which temporal flows are subordinate to regional ontologies and spatial enclosures, right? So rather than this kind of unilineal model, which is often associated with the idea of progress, a kind of evolutionary trajectory in Hegel, but again, that also can be contested. That's a mixed story. Historical time is unilinear for the most part, right? This is kind of historical progression or periodization to the becoming self-consciousness of consciousness. What Foucault begins discussing in the archeology of knowledge, where he mounts this attack on Hegel and associating Hegel and Marx with this humanist model of historical time, where the man is the privileged subject of history, of historical becoming. Man basically posits his, and I mean that gender pronoun literally, because women and also colonial subjects are not part of this definition of man, of humanity, posits his identity through a kind of circular representation of historical time, where man alienates himself into objective forms, into objective material and institutional apparatuses, and eventually will come to recuperate himself through disalienation, which was for many up to Althusser, the authoritative description of the Marxist project. And Foucault rejects this kind of unilinear and kind of anthropocentric or anthropogenetic model of historical time. And I think in the archeology of knowledge, he does so because he's quite sensitive, though he doesn't explicitly mention it, to the fact that this kind of anthropogenetic humanism excludes certain subjects, like colonial subjects, people who were busy decolonizing themselves in the late 60s, early 70s, when Foucault was writing his archeology of knowledge. Of course, gendered subjects, right? And sexual alterities, because Foucault also, to a certain degree, is writing as a gay subject, and understood to which degree that these dissonant, excluded, exiled subjects, these unhuman subjects, or non-human subjects, are basically excluded from this kind of anthropogenetic humanist history. And in that project, Foucault began to introduce, yeah?
Is it okay if we can just interrupt you when we have a question, or should we ask questions later?
No, it's fine. Give me just 2 minutes to finish the sentence, and then you can go.
Yeah, okay.
So in the archeology knowledge, Foucault basically begins representing his kind of spatial pluralization of historical time as the delinearization of history. And a similar discourse in the delinearization of time emerges in Derrida's book of grammatology, which precedes the archeology of knowledge. So this is kind of the culmination of this inversion of the negation of space by time associated with Hegel Marx, and the kind of post-structuralist critique of unilinear time as a kind of power knowledge apparatus that tended to exclude subjects that were seen as inadmissible to Western anthropocentric humanism. Okay, questions or interventions?
Yes. In relation to this anthropocentric or anthropogenetic view of history by Hegel and Marx, and especially in regards to Marx, what you said that gendered subject, colonized subjects are actually excluded out of this notion of, okay, that labor as the activity of the human grappling with nature and transforming nature, that how exactly are gendered subjects and colonized subjects excluded there? Because this seems as a very, very abstract notion if one doesn't see labor as wage labor, but as labor as a trans-historical thing. I mean, one can debate that if Marx actually conceptualizes it as a trans-historical thing, but yeah, how exactly are they excluded?
well, because one, they're naturalized, but in Marxism, by one of the phenomena that characterizes that begins to emerge at the end of World War II with the decolonial project is that thinking of the work of Lukács and his appropriation of Marxism, that where Lukács says that the proletariat is the identical subject and object of historical process, and that privileged subject of historical transformation is someone associated with the factory floor, that particular privileged site of historical change, and is generally male and generally European, right? And one of the things that emerges at the end of World War II with decolonization, but also with the feminist movement and subsequent movements, is what I call the kind of subjectification, the emergence of new political subjectivities, and in accordance with Foucault's approach, the emergence of new spaces of political activity, whether it's the process of decolonization that Fanon describes in Branches of the Earth, or it's a domestic sphere for feminists, right? Or it's the sphere of sexuality and bed, or later on, compromised immune systems, disability, the emergence of plural subjects and plural sites of struggle and contestation. And of course, we can think about ecosystems as also emerging, and particularly animal species emerging as accountable political subjects to whom we owe a certain accountability and liability to. So I don't think Marx was very good in describing, I mean, his descriptions of China, his description of India, basically as not really participating in historical time. This is what Foucault wanted to correct, that there were different historical narratives, and there's that great scene at the end of Battle of Algiers, where the Algerians, after a series of non-violent demonstrations, emerge out of the fog and tear gas inflicted on them by the French police and army in Algiers. And there's a policeman saying, "What do you people want? What do you want?" And they emerge out of this fog of being dehistoricized into history as historical agents and actors. So I think this is something we have to think about. Maybe this liability lies more in the actual political organization of Marxism in the 20th century, and less so than Marx's text, though. But that was a kind of concrete historical reality. I mean, we have to understand the degree to which Foucault is writing in reaction to the PCP in France at that time, his hegemony.
Yeah, because what you just said with, okay, the side of struggle, the proletariat in factories and so on. I mean, that is first wage labor, and then a specific form of a historically contingent form of wage labor. And because I don't, labor doesn't need to be wage labor in this sense. And okay, maybe we can go to that into that more in later discussion, but yeah, at least for now, I don't see.
You're referring to slavery you're talking about. Yeah.
What?
But Marx's stage theory basically, identifies revolution with the advanced industrial countries. That's where revolution takes
But
place.
then it's the question of the reception of Marxism. Do we accept that or not? And the question, okay, Marxism is a unitary bloc and we have to say, okay, goodbye, or retake everything. That's a question of the reception and not of, yeah.
That's another story. Certainly there can be rereadings and recalibrations. As Achille Mbembe has done with Agamben in his discussion of necropolitics, which also attacks Agamben for a kind of Eurocentric perspective on biopolitics. Okay, other questions or interventions? Okay.
Well, I'll ask you one question, and this is really a point for you to elaborate either now or at some point later. There's a specific passage, I don't recall exactly where, in Foucault's Society Must Be Defended, where he takes up Hegel and the Hegelian dialectic, and he essentially reduces the dialectic to that which ensures the historical constitution of a universal subject, a reconciled truth, a right to all particularities ordained in their place according to, and he I think pretty explicitly uses the word colonization and authoritarian colonization as like this historical political discourse that is at once a statement of fact, a proclamation, a practice of social warfare. So he, in a sense, I would even go as far as to say that he reduces the dialectic to doing the dirty work of ideology. Now, I'd like specifically for you to address whether he's doing a bit of a sleight of hand, because really I would say a lot of the project of those working on ideology and Hegel, and something that Meier elaborates from Lacan, but really Badiou takes up, and other people today who are Hegelians, but work on ideology. Zizek is a big famous other one, are able to parse that, you know, science constitutes itself as a closed operational space that can separate itself from, but still remain relative to ideology at its margins. And this is the great, you know, liberatory aspect of the dialectic. But, you know, this is not, you know, the genealogy of constituent histories in Foucault is not really susceptible to any type of dialectical apparatus. It almost seems to like do with the dialectic as ideology and then pick up this more Nietzschean master of suspicion, you know, method.
Yes, I think we need to reserve that question through our reading of Hegel and Kojève, because in my work, I found Hegelian moments in Foucault that go unrecognized by him, as I did in Derrida, and I think we can find Foucaultian moments in Hegel as well as Kojève. But you're right. That's his argument also in the archeology of knowledge, that the universal subject is the colonizer, you know, and it's excluding other subaltern figures, and that's the premise of humanist historiography or humanist philosophy, where man is the universal subject, whether it's a proletariat, the bourgeoisie is supposed to be the privileged subject of historical becoming, historical periodization. Okay. Okay, other comments or interventions? Okay. So I just want to get this notion of the body as a site for historical truth-claiming, historical veridiction, which I think almost all the theorists we're going to be looking at share to one degree or another, though may have a different definition of the political and of the historical. So I would argue that this notion of the historical surface or historiographic surface, the body as an historiographic surface, so that means it's inscribed, decomposed, recomposed, and even the body as a bearer of historical meaning and significance and messaging, even in its destructibility. So it's not just basically an intact integral body we're talking about fragments of the body as well. So I would argue that political power first constructs itself by constructing the surfaces and sites for its staging, display, and its narratives, its self-descriptive narratives. That the body is mediological. It's a mediological support as a, and I'm going to use a Greek term here called hypokaimenon, Hypokeimenon, which literally means that which lies under. The support, the subjectile, which is usually reserved for media artifacts that have a kind of allow for inscription and transmission, like writing ledgers, you know, manuscript scrolls and things like that. Though Derrida also describes that the understanding of the soul and the body, that distinction gets transferred from to the act of writing, in which the writer is a soul and the support of the hypokaimenon is the space of archivization. And then the other word here that would be crucial to understand this notion of the historiographic surface is hypomonimata. It comes from monimata, which means memory, right? And hypo means paramemory or above memory or supplementary memory, and literally means an archival prosthetic, right? And the performance of these sites embodies aims at making history appear. Selects acceleration of time or temporalization of history, which history becomes the object of political action, occurs through the medium of the body. It's a space for the visualization of historical temporality, historical transformation, many ways in which Benjamin also connected that to the concept of the ruin. So whoever seeks power must first control the apparatus for the production and mimesis of history as a materiality. The phenomenology of the historical surface is a phenomenology of the historical fetish. Those chosen text or textures where the formal movement of history is imagined, envisioned, where history effects are stored, embedded, and recursively transmitted, like the terrorist, the undocumented immigrant, the compromised immune system, the Islamo-fascist, the Chinese virus, and gendered and sexual authorities. So here the body functions as a prosthetic, as a supplement, and as archive for political power. And we find here the fusion of the forms and substance of power, the synthesis of the performance, the artifacts, and the command of power, which I would argue is a profound rejection of abstract juridical power, which both Foucault and Hegel have in common. So this is one point of interface. The rejection, at least at a certain stage of their analysis, of abstract juridical power. This means the propensity to distinguish between the enactment or performativity of power by a body, upon a body, and through the body, and on one hand, in an idealized juridical reserve of power that has an independent relationship to any particular instantiation. Foucault is well known for rejecting the thesis of sovereignty, rejecting the thesis of a centralized Archimedean point from which power emanates, like from a bank account, and rather part of his kind of multiplication of temporal trajectories and space and multiple spaces in which power is inscribed, produced, and reproduced in time and space is a notion that power only exists through site-specific performances, usually as enacted upon a body through a combination of discourse and practice, which in and of themselves can create centration effects, create the illusion of a center of power from which an Archimedean point. And the kind of key kind of allegory for this is Nietzsche's parallel of the lightning strike. And in the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche basically talks about, he says, when we say the lightning strikes, we double the doer behind the doing, right? We invent a kind of anthropocentric agent that makes the lightning strike. But for Nietzsche, there is no doer behind the doing. The doing and the doer is fused together in the same enactment. And this is how Foucault understood the implementation or the instantiation of executive power. So I would argue that the emblematic victim body, whether it's a slave or someone who's tortured, is simultaneously the bearer of a political value, a communicant, an inscribed surface, and an inscribing agency. It is both presence and absence, inert and active, a thing and a persona, signal and noise. The emblematic victim, and for Hegel, the slave is an emblematic victim, is an exemplary victim, right? What he wants to make an example of the slave is political power as pure effect, Forms of random violence particularly amplify the targeted body as a presentation of effective power, power as pure presence without a tangible Archimedean point outside of the political value that's invested in it. And this kind of recent example of that is Gregor Shamayu's book on manhunts, when he talks about synergetic power, which is a power that does not have any transcendental authorization, it's purely immanent power. And this is the synergetic power is the power that Shamayu, and I would agree with him, explicitly associates with enslavement. So I would contend that, and we should probably, people want to stop for a break at a certain point? Is that usual in these classes? Yeah, people nodding, okay. So let me just finish this one section and then we'll stop for a break. And then I'd like to continue with Du Bois. So in both the work of Derrida and Foucault, political power is associated with these hypomonimata, these supplemental artifice devices that support, repeat, and preserve political memory. In the classical Hellenic and Latin world, hypomonimata were originally copybooks of memoranda, account books, public registers, individual notebooks, dream books, and guides of conduct, okay? But Foucault, in his work on technologies of the self, stresses that hypomonimata enable the defragmentation of lived experience and discourse. And he moved beyond the utility of the hypomonimata as an external supportive memory in relating it to self-government. And this concept of self-government is crucial to Aristotle's notion of slavery and also crucial to Hegel's and Kordjev's discussion of the master-slave dialectic. Foucault associates hypomonimata with apparatuses that enable the permanent relation of self to self, described as the self-subjection of a subject to a mediating and external supplement. And we're going to counter this notion of the production of a master subject through a surrogate body in the Hegel/Kordjevian discussion of slavery, right? Where the master constitutes himself as such through the embodiment/disembodiment or virtual disembodiment of the enslaved. And we also will find this in Fanon, in his, particularly in his encounter with the child in the chapter called Fact of Blackness, which we'll be looking at as well, where he says the black becomes a Negro or a black only vis-a-vis the gaze in the discourse of a white man, only in relationship to a white man. And Foucault is very much, Fanon is very much commenting on Hegel here, even though he has his disagreements with Hegel. So Foucault relates this notion of the external supplemental memory prosthetic archive, which can be a living human body, to self-government. Though he kind of rejected apical models of political sovereignty, in his discussion of techniques of self and prosthetic memory, he provides a mnemonic theory of political sovereignty as self-affirmation through prosthetic self-othering. And this is a kind of key framework we have to keep our eye on throughout this course. Self-affirmation through prosthetic self-othering. And this is a quote from Foucault's book. The constitution of a permanent relationship to oneself, one must manage oneself as a governor manages the governed. This new idea that virtue consists essentially in perfectly governing oneself, that is, in exercising upon oneself as exact a mastery as that of a sovereign against whom there would no longer be revolts. against a sovereign. He's talking about internal, that one cannot govern others until one learns to govern oneself. At the same time, he's also saying that you learn to govern oneself through repressing revolts from others, right? So Foucault's early engagement with panopticism and the body, which most of you are familiar with, under compulsory visibility, are concerned with the body as a retentional apparatus, as a form of power insofar as the circuitry formed by visuality, attention, disciplinary and orthopedic surveillance, and the archival volume of the body to be attended or surveilled permit an uninterrupted continuity of power, a continuum of care, discipline, and ascesis through external prosthetics. And this is when Foucault was asked why he kind of concentrated on visuality and the body, is because he said he was interested in uninterrupted continuity of power, which was provided by the body as a historiographic surface under a panoptical omnivoyant gaze. So in the panopticon and in other places, the government of self, of a sovereign self, of a master self, whether it's the prison guard or the prison apparatus as a master subject or other forms of governmentality, takes form through the passage into the supplemental other as a mode of self-limitation instated by an illimitable sovereign subject. If you're going to incarnate your subject to it in the body of an other, that's already establishes you as sovereign. Because you are delimiting yourself in what you consider to be an inferior body, but it's a choice you make, which also you reserve for the for the sovereign self, a certain illimitability, right? That can choose which bodies it's going to incarnate itself in. And I'm going to argue that this incarnation, this transfer, this transcription, this inscription usually takes the form of various forms of subjugation, subjection, and violence, or some form of modification of the body. In Hegel and Kordjev, it will take the form of the virtuality of anticipatory terror, which reorganizes, by which the master occupies the subject of the slave. In Fanon, it is the literal occupation of the double consciousness of the colonized by a white gaze and by white discourse. Black skins, white masks. White masks is not what white people are wearing, is what Black people are wearing, because they have internalized white representations of Black otherness. And this is what Fanon is talking about. And there's literally, and he talks about this experience as a form of disintegrative embodiment and a reoccupation and reorganization of his bodily schema vis-a-vis and in relationality to a kind of white public space, which we'll get into. So the government of self takes form in Foucault through the passage into a supplemental other as a mode of self-limitation. These Foucauldian technologies of self fuse care with attention, producing what Bernard Stiegler and Jonathan Crary have more recently argued, mediating retentional apparatuses. So begin to look at the subjugated body, the subaltern body, as an archive of a master discourse, of a power of mastery, of sovereignty, that basically archives it. And here I am kind of inserting into this. I noticed on the chat that Ekin made a reference to Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt argued that the friend-enemy relation is the foundational relation for all political structures, for all politics, right? And when you begin to read Schmitt, you begin to see to what degree that the sovereign, the person who announces, or the agency or apparatus that declares the state of exception, is an apparatus that lodges, consigns its identity in the figure, the tropology of the enemy of the other. So this is a kind of slight Hegelian variation or Foucauldian variation on this. So we're dealing here with an exposure. And I pronounce this word exposure with a hyphen between ex and posure. It's a posing of the body in front of itself. And here I remind you of Lacan's mirror stage, which we can talk about, where the body is posed in front of itself in a spectral form, and then transfers, and then internalized, transfers the identity to that spectral phantasmagoric figure. And of course, in slavery, in colonization, the colonized, the slave, is simultaneously a material entity and a phantasmagoric figure. Jacques Derrida calls this recursive call of subjectifying permanence formed by retentional and intentional interfaces, ipsocracy, I-P-S-O-C-R-A-C-Y, the being same of oneself, as a principle of autonomy and sovereignty. The Latin intensive pronoun ipse, self or same, is a kratia, a power, a capability as a self-positing and self-determining will to continuity, knowledge, and autonomy. And for Derrida, self-substitution, which links his understanding of mastery to Hegel and Fanon, because with both Foucault and Derrida, this sovereign self-positing and self-posing must pass through an exposure, an alterity, a template of self-substitution that is inherently archival, the hypomnetic interface, be it a weapon, another body, a figure, a structuring alterity, which involves a determination of the identity of self through negation. So for example, in thinking of the human and the non-human, of the human of the animal, is that all these definitions of the unhuman and non-human and of the animal are basically, what do you call that, relational attempts to define the human through its determination through negation. So the unhuman, the animal, the monstrous are determinations of negation that are necessary for defining what the human is. So it's a transactional dimension and relationship.
Alan, may I ask a question?
Yeah, and then we'll take a break.
Is that okay?
Yes.
This I'm like, let's see. I'm just wondering, I've always thought of the mirror as a certain type of technological object, and I'm just trying to connect this to some of my experiences in the computer art world, particularly at NYU, and the sort of people that talk about new media and stuff. And there's an infatuation with using these things like Kinect sensors to sort of make this mirror-like thing where you stand in front of a sensor and you move your body, and then it sort of the screen shows you your body back with a billion particles, and there's sort of particle physics and graphics. And that's 90% of the design work that gets done is the production of these sort of flow mirrors. And, it's sort of a funhouse mirror. But I'm just wondering in terms of a sort of ruling class, we could say every, in terms of white members of a class, consciously or unconsciously, and here's my question, consciously or unconsciously create mirrors for subjugated class members, and that could be the child talking about eating up the black man. But what is the drive to create a mirror for someone else? And is that and maybe that's a big question, but I'm just wondering how you might pose that right now. What is this, is it an aesthetic drive towards the creation of a mirror for another? Yeah.
Well, we can't separate aesthetics from politics, as Benjamin observed. I think you're perfectly correct in the sense that in Lacan's essay on the mirror stage, the mirror is first of all, the essay is it's a kind of surrealistic essay because it conforms to Dali's notion of the paranoid object, which is an object without any alteration of its form or content can mean more than one thing at the same time. So it appears as an essay on child development. Yes, it certainly is an essay about the role of media in 20th century modernity and of media fetishism. What I find interesting about Lacan in this discussion, it might connect to this experimentation you just described, is that experimentation sounds to me as a continuation of Marshall McLuhan's definition of media as extensions of man, in which basically media extend an already complete human, but amplify that humanity in supplemental trajectories and directions through a variety of interface performances. So that it kind of preserves a certain kind of mimetic fidelity to the origin, right? But also amplifies it, right? Repeats it on different levels. So this kind of transmutation from the surface of the body into its molecular pixels, this pixelation or molecular pixelation sounds like a continuation of that. Now I may be wrong because I'm not very familiar with these practices, but in Lacan, rather than looking at mirroring or the mirror as extending an already complete human being as kind of, which is attempt to normalize and domesticate media prosthetics, the mirroring begins with disability. It's an incomplete, fragmented subject. And he's very much influenced by Hegel here, because the master seeks recognition from the slave, because the master himself is an incomplete subject until he can, or it can complete itself, because we can talk about apparatus as much as a person. We can talk about institutions as subjects, complete itself through this notion of recognition, i.e. looking, though that's not the only form of recognition that the master receives, because he also receives labor service from the slave. But in Lacan's essay, the child has a fragmented, incomplete body at 6 months, right? And completes his body through mimetic play in front of this mirror spectral image, which appears as a complete version of himself, which is basically the child projecting himself into the future through desire. And this notion of desire, which always begins in lack, in what you are not, and projecting yourself into what you will be through this act of becoming through an imaginary entity, through a spectrality, is something that Lacan does pick up from the master-slave dialectic. And we can also say that the slave is a mirror device for the master. But what's interesting in Lacan is that this comes out of disability and this dependency, this reliance on the spectral image to complete your body, right? Virtually complete, as a simulacral completion of the body, precipitates what I only could call an addiction, a dependency. And he calls it, he uses a very interesting word when he describes this process. He calls the mirror orthopedic, right? Orthopedic, if you have a deformed foot, you might buy an orthopedic shoe that will correct your deformity, to correct your disability, allowing you to walk halfway or, mostly, quote, normally, unquote, right? So the mirror is a supplement, a prosthetic supplement that both corrects and completes and heals a disability, but also at the same time perpetuates it, right? Through dependency, through addiction. And it's quite obvious to me, maybe not to others, when you read that essay, that he's also talking about commodity fetishism. And of course, there's discussion by people like Hal Foster, and I'm trying to remember the other author's name on, there's a very interesting essay on Lacan, which is a critique of him, but actually it's one of the best descriptions of Lacan by Boris Jacobson, who talks about the statue, that Lacan basically saw society as comprised of a series of statues, emblematic spectral images. This is taken up in this concept of the mass subject, where basically Hollywood, celebrity culture, reality TV, thinking of Andy Warhol's work, his famous essay by Hal Forster, Death in America, basically generate these tropes of the mass subject to which we project our identities and from which we extract our identities. So that is a partial answer to your question. Okay. Sure.
Well, I just the follow-up was about the lightning strikes that you were talking about and this sort of like enactment.
Yeah.
And I feel like the mass subject is sort of what becomes enacted in this sort of like addictive behavior or something like this.
Yes, no, I would agree with you, 100%. I think, the notion, it's interesting, the notion of performatives, that basically came out of the Berkeley School of Linguistics, always presumed a stable subject that was the author, the intentional author of a performance. But I think in Foucault and some other writers, in my own work, I used to teach performance studies at NYU. Subjects are constructed through performances. They don't pre-exist the performance. They construct and reconstruct themselves. There are subject effects that are the consequences of performance practices, particularly the material practices that alter the structure of the human sensorium or the human body. There's a very interesting phrase, if I could introduce some anthropology here briefly, by this great book by Hubert and Maus on sacrifice. And they're talking about, the sacrifice is based on the distinction between the profane world and the other world, the next world, right? And they're discussing sacrifice, and they come up with this this kind of maxim about doing a kind of comparative analysis. They were French anthropologists who didn't do ethnography, but did kind of comparative ethnology. He said, they said, to describe sacrifice in the following way: in order to move something from this world to the next world, first it must be destroyed. In order to move something, you think of the sacrificial object or subject, animal, human being, artifact. In order to move something from this world to the next world, first it must be destroyed. So if you secularize that and to say, in order to move a social order or a collection of bodies from the present historical moment into the next historical periodization, first they must be destroyed. And I think this is kind of the notion of the body, again, as a prosthetic supplement through which history and historical transformation is being envisioned through the manipulation, deformation, mutilation, disfiguration of the body, either at the level of actual concrete material practices or through promissory violence, promissory threat, which is what we'll encounter in the Hegelian master-slave relationship. So at this point, why don't we take a 5-minute break or 10-minute break? What do people want? Water and bathrooms, oxygen, whatever you're doing.
5 is enough.
What?
5 should be enough.
Okay, so 3:36 will come back. That's my time. I don't know what time you guys have. This is Eastern Standard Time. In 5 minutes, let's say, whatever is your time. And feel free to shut down your camera and everything else.
Alan, are you aware of these 2 Foucault texts that are coming to us in the next few months? Finally, we're getting the 4th book of Histories of Sexuality and Confessions of the Flesh. That's coming, I think, in the summer. And then this one, this may interest you more. I posted a link to it in the chat. It's called Intolerable: Writings from Michel Foucault and the Prisons Information Group. And I think it's mostly like manifestos, posters, and artifacts and like scans and such of the GIP.
How do you copy text from the chats? I've always had problems with that since I started teaching on Zoom. Like I want to copy that link you put in there.
I'm not sure how we do it, but I know that the News Center publishes them and sends a link after 24 hours after each lecture finishes. So I don't know how you and I would do it, but I do know they get published and circulated via email. So you'll probably get an email tomorrow with the whole chat bar and the link to the video.
Okay, because I just tried to copy and paste and it didn't work. So.
Oh, you just mean copy and paste? Oh, really? It doesn't work?
No, I got the New Center something like, like everybody, the kind of prelude to the whole chat. Let me try it again.
Alan, I can try to also repaste it and see if it helps.
Yeah, thank you.
But like there's this new rendering of Foucault as like a pre-neoliberal thinker, techniques of the self and self-care and such as sort of, and of course, yes, he had a part in like softening those hardcore Maoist positions. I understand it. But still, the GIP work that he did and the activist work he did, which I feel like, you are sort of, in the lineage of, because you did, as you say, clinical work and such, that often gets, ignored or briefly mentioned.
Yeah, well, it's extensively discussed in that, not the Ereban biography, the other one, the one that came out in Verso. Actually, I just finished reading that a couple of months ago. We discussed extensively his prison work and all the protests and manifestos he was involved in, and ghostwritten. A lot of them ghostwritten.
This one is The Lives of Michel Foucault, I guess.
Well, if you want to get the sense of this kind of neoliberal approach, there was this seminar conducted at 13-week seminar, Foucault 1313, chaired by Bernard Harcourt, where really the general discussion. Are you familiar with it?
I know Bernard Harcourt, but I don't know the 1313.
It's online. You go Foucault 1313, where basically most of the commentators, few were French, but most of them were Anglophone, and really did not really understand the kind of post-structuralist understanding of the subject that really Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, and others had shared in many ways, right? They presumed a stable subject at the origin of any kind of political practice or instantiation, rather than the notion of a subject as the effect of power rather than the author of power. And a lot of the discussions revolved around that misunderstanding, which they didn't understand at the time was a misunderstanding.
Interesting.
And what's her name? Who's that famous Deleuzian scholar, Dutch woman, feminist, great feminist. Great.
She did Amsterdam, the
Rosie Braidotti?
Yes. So she presented towards the end of that 13 weeks, and she completely, unknowing, well, I mean, she did it politely. She really deconstructed the whole misapprehension of the Foucauldian concept of the subject. So if you can listen to her presentation, it was utterly brilliant, and she's speaking as a Deleuzian, but of course there's a lot of empathy between Deleuze and Foucault, and she basically deconstructed what they were getting wrong throughout the previous 12 weeks of that seminar. Yeah, she definitely were. It's called Foucault 1313. It came out maybe 3 years. It's been 4 years ago. Unless they took the site down.
I mean, I see something at the blog of Columbia Law School about it. Yeah. So there's definitely some links there. I'm trying to find it.
Okay, are people back? Okay, so what I've been talking about is this issue of the body as prosthetic under situations of mastery. And I want to move into our actual readings, and probably only have time to discuss Page Dubois, which I think is a very powerful and unfortunately neglected book. It's certainly one of the best books on torture that I've ever read. Created with Elaine Scarry's A Body in Pain. And actually, a lot of the torture literature since then has been quite disappointing. In The Politics, on page 1255b, Aristotle talks about slavery, societies where slavery doesn't occur, societies where slavery is seen, where people are slaves and others are freemen by nature. And this is actually Aristotle's primary understanding of slavery, that you are enslaved by nature. You are condemned to be slave, maybe a kind of notion of fate. Greek Meier is appearing there to such a degree that in one of his writings, he shows that a slave who was branded that subsequently had children, and all the children were born with a birthmark on the arm, precisely a circular birthmark on the arm, precisely where the slave's original brand was. So this is the degree to which Aristotle naturalized slavery. He says, and this kind of connects him to Foucault's discussion of government of self through government of others and vice versa. He says, when slavery for the one and mastership for the other are advantageous and just, it is proper for the one party to be governed and for the other party to govern by the form of government for which they are by nature fitted, and therefore by the exercise of mastership, while to govern badly is to govern disadvantageously for both the master and the slave. And then he says, and this is a very interesting concept here, for he says, for the same thing, good governance, is advantageous for a part and for the whole body or the whole soul. So he talks about the part in relation to a whole body or the whole soul. And then he goes on to say, the slave is part of the master. He is, as it were, a part of the body, alive, but yet separated from it. Hence, there's a certain community of interest and friendship between slave and master in cases where they have been qualified by nature for those positions, although when they do not hold them in that way, but by law and by constraint of force, the opposite is the case. Well, he never presents us with this kind of amicable form of mastery and slavery. Here I would argue, and I think this is what Dubois would agree with, is that the slave is represented as a prosthetic of the master's body, an extension that's part of, yet separate. And of course, in Aristotle, you have this distinction between logos and phone. Logos means reasoned speech. Phone means, I guess, to translate the way Agamben would translate it, as bare or naked voice. And for Aristotle, logos is basically heteronormative, masculinist, anthropological invariant, according to Jacques Rancière. He calls it an anthropological variant, which is the basis of political community, because it's where men get together in a defined, exclusive space to reason out the good and to arrive at justice, right? And they do that because they possess logos. Logos in Greek can translate as rationality, reasoned speech, spirit, and law. All has these multiple meanings. So it's basically admissible, authoritative, publicly validated speech. And phone, and basically slaves, women, children, and barbarians and animals don't have logos for Aristotle. This is Agamben's famous Zoe bios distinction. To a certain degree, it could be amended, qualified. But for Aristotle, slaves, women, children, barbarians, and animals can apprehend speech, but they do not possess it, right? In other words, they can follow orders, but they cannot reason with it logically. So I think page 66 of her book, Torture of Truth, Dubois says, thus, according to Aristotle's logic, the slave's truth is the master's truth. It is in the body of the slave that the master truth lies. As in torture, that his truth is revealed. The torturer reaches through the master to the slave's body and extracts truth from it. The body of the tortured on the rack, on the wheel, and under the whip assumes a relationship to truth. Truth is constituted as residing in the body of the slave because he can apprehend reason without possessing reason. Truth, aletheia, comes from elsewhere, from another place, from the place of the other, i.e. from the sight of the slave. Now what she's summing up here is summarizing this Athenian legal doctrine, which also I think was extant under Roman law too, is that you could not torture a citizen when they were involved in a criminal or other form of legal adjudication in order to find the truth. If you had two conflicting testimonies coming from parties who were both citizens. So you couldn't torture the citizen, but what you could do is torture the citizen slave, who would produce an involuntary, non-normative witnessing of the truth or non-truth of the master's actions or discourses and saying, and practices that are relevant to the trial. The slave could be tortured because the slave is not a citizen. And yet the slave is part of the master, right? Almost functioning as a kind of archival prosthetic of the master's deeds and actions and words. So here we have a first early example of a prostheticized body as an archive for a sovereign entity. And we should remember here that despite Greek and Roman democracy, what Agamben, Arendt, and others have argued is that the concept of sovereignty, of mastery, basically originates not in the agora where democratic debates were taking place or in the Roman Senate, but in the oikos, the domestic sphere, the household, in which, and there's some very interesting work that's been done on the concept of juridical personality, where the juridical personality in Greek thought, Greek legal thought, of the master of the household consisted not just of his individuality or his individual body, the way you and I have a juridical personality as autonomous individuals, subjects, right? But his juridical personality included his body, the bodies of his wife, children, slaves, and animals, right? So all that was part of the master's corporate or political corporeality or juridical personality. So it was a different understanding of the body that was not premised on a foundational notion of monad, of a monadic individual, right? So the slave is part of this non-monadic distributed body relationship. And that's why he or she could be tortured because he was a kind of involuntary witnesses of archival witness or retention apparatus of the sayings and doings of the master. So where does this come from, this notion of mastery and slavery? And what is the material roots of this relationship in Aristotle? Maybe I should skip over that first. Okay, so let's stick with that's a note that I want to return to later on. I want to talk about Aristotle's notion of political action as technical action, but I'll leave that for later on. So to go back to Dubois. So in her book, to discuss this notion of the slave's body as a site of verediction. Verediction in Foucauldian thought is speaking truth, right? Though that body only speaks truth involuntarily through the application of instruments of torture, through the penetration of these instruments of torture, through cries of pain as well. We don't have, literal transcriptions. There would be a torturer, there would be a slave, there would be witnesses, and there would be a scribe taking down the slave's testimony. And so slaves were not allowed to enter into the courtroom space, only the transcription of their testimony could enter into the courtroom space. And that was the other justification for torturing slaves to get juridical testimony. Now, like any good theorist of torture, and they are few and far between, as in Lane Scarry, as in my own work, not to sound narcissistic, and in Dubois' work, the idea of extracting information is considered secondary or tertiary in the ritual and performativity or enactment of torture. Torture as a ceremony and ritual. And in Dubois' work, she argues that torture was a ceremony, a ritual that was used to demarcate the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. So it had this extra juridical, extra testimonial function that she considers as important or even more important than the extraction of testimony from the victim. Okay, so, and in talking about this, she talks about how the Greeks applied this concept, or the Athenians applied this concept of the touchstone, or basanos, B-A-S-A-N-O-S, and that torture would get to the touchstone of the truth, right? We get to the actual real truth. And I should also put it here that the Greek term aletheia is a privative. So it's combined of two words, the prefix a, which is a privative, and lethe, which means forgetfulness or forgetting. So the Greek understanding of truth, which Heidegger adopts much later on, is to be without forgetfulness, to be without forgetting. So if the slave is seen as a entity, I wouldn't say a person, now we even want to say a subject, but an instrumentum vocali, as the Romans, speaking instrument, right? He or it or she can be a site of erudition because they are without forgetting. So they have an archival function. And the archive, the master, literally. So Dubois traces the semantic mutation of the touchstone principle in Greek law, philosophy, literature, and theater to the point where the technique, the touchstone originally meant, the basanos meant a stone against which you would test the authenticity of gold, of something claiming to be gold, right? You would rub it, this rock or a piece of jewelry, whatever, that the owner or the seller claimed to be gold. You would rub it against this stone, and if the stone tarnished it in some way, then it wouldn't be verified as gold. So the notion of basanos engages in a forensic procedure, right? That it gets elaborated from testing precious minerals to juridical altercations. So it's forensic and it's procedural, and it's about a kind of physical intervention that will get at the truth, right? Here I also want to stress the work of Pierre Hadot, who wrote this very famous, powerful book on the concept of nature in Greek thought of the same period that Dubois is writing about. And one of the things that Hadot talks about, Hadot was a big influence on Foucault's work on techniques of the self, was that scientific investigation of natural phenomena in 5th century Greece was described as, quote, torturing nature for its secrets. So the extraction of the secrets of nature, scientific experimentation, was seen as a form of torture, right? Of coercive extraction from a resistant subject of the secrets that entity or, contains within it. So the notion that the slave could be tortured in order and exploited or objectified as a site of veridiction, truth speaking, skewed the cultural production of truth in that society as a production of knowledge and a juridical subject from out of fear and pain. of the slave as a violently discarded and disqualified extra societal feature of what I call Hellenic apartheid, an entity who was both inside and outside the social order. Quite frequently in ancient Greece, slaves are metaphorized or compared to dogs. Dogs were seen as this very kind of dangerous, anomic animal because, one, they could be domesticated, right, as household pets, but also in the aftermath of battles, it was the dogs that would come and consume the bodies of corpses. So dogs were seen as both inside and outside society at the same time, as was the slave, who was often called a dog or compared to a dog. And of course, we could link this up to Shamayu's book on manhunting, synergetic power. The word, which comes from Aristotle, who saw hunting animals, but also men, as an art, as a technology, as a technique. And synergetic comes from kinos, which means dog, right? The use of hunting dogs to track down a prey. So there is that connection as well. So as this notion of the basanos, the touchstone, becomes more proximate to violence in lore, political agon, and theater, right? It kind of, as I say, it gets transferred from the sphere of gemstone authentication, and also obviously it's concerned with counterfeiting, authentication, authenticity, and forensics. It becomes increasingly associated with acts of violence, both in Hellenic lore, Greek lore, but also in tragic theater. Hellenic tragedy expressed this locus through the commingling of the true and the counterfeit in the reversible speech of tragedy's protagonist in scenarios of violence. There's this very interesting approach to language that you don't find in lore, and you certainly don't find in Plato or in Aristotle to a great degree, though there it is shown where Plato does do this, where you're saying one thing, but what you're saying in your discourse actually has a double meaning, which reveals a completely opposite or inverted truth. And this is the type of use of the touchstone in Hellenic tragedy, where it had a much more ambivalent, ambiguous relationship to this kind of conformational dimension of violence as a vehicle for getting to the truth of things. So this is what essentially is in question here. Violence as a truth-producing medium, particularly in its interface with the body. And so the self-subverting performance of truth-telling that's foregrounded in tragic theater dramatizes the paradox of any violence that claims to test and to make historical truth through an ordeal is itself subject to reversibility, to a double bind. Tragic theater gravitated to the riddle that if violence becomes a touchstone, the medium of accrediting truth and testing the counterfeit, then what stands as a touchstone to this touchstone? Who decides the efficacy of violence and whether it authenticates or counterfeits? Violence as an absolute touchstone automatically counterfeits itself by unilaterally withdrawing from purview the validity and intelligibility of any other criteria for ascertaining truth. Thus, no binding political or legal institution tortured the practice of torture to extract its truth in 5th century Athens. And there were commentators who did dispute the efficacy of torture, saying people say anything under torture, usually what we have now. But this is a debate that's still going on in the United States, where you have this debate over enhanced interrogation versus torture. When is it enhanced interrogation, and when is it torture? And I began to conclude in my own work that this debate was about not ascertaining the illegality of enhanced interrogation, but rather deferring or delaying any kind of legal legitimation or legal decriminalization or criminalization of torture, keeping it in a suspended state, because it's never really been resolved.
If you're looking at are you looking at the chats? Or I have a question. Maybe
sure.
we can
stop.
because it's related, but it's also Dubois goes on to talk about the Platonic dialogues in reference to Hesiod and the sophist quad, this touchstone, and about how Plato stages something of a conduct of philosophical parricide. I think it's on pages 177, and the word manhunting is used next to torture and bondage. That Plato conducts an act of philosophical parricide with the sophist. This is very interesting because we see sort of what we were discussing earlier, a contention about does the dialectic, and she separates the Platonic dialogue from the dialectic because she says the dialogue exacts a hierarchical relationship between a master and discipline. We could, say, no, master discipline is a dialectical relationship. It's, there's a whole premise on its negativity that's ruptured by itself and contains itself. That's not so important as it is. You already have this way of like philosophy as artifact, philosophy as technology of history. This is sort of like embedded into what you're talking about too. If you want to talk about that, I find it pretty interesting, but a small note that she makes within the wider discourse.
But she also has, in my opinion, a more powerful and contemporary understanding of the concept of veridiction, of truth claiming and truth making through her passage through the torture by the slave, which she also in this text constantly compares to the treatment of the body of women as a form of container, right? And she wrote an earlier book called Sewing the Body, which was about the kind of subordinate, subjugating representation of women's bodies in Greek thought. So I want to get to the spatialized model that she arrives at, which I think is quite profound and quite relevant to any discussion of subaltern studies, colonial studies, decolonial studies, racism, and can relate to Fenelon's work, which we'll probably end up discussing next week. So in the book, Dubois stages a profound anterior encounter with its epistemology of witnessing the slave in Athenian democracy, which really tortured slaves for the involuntary and supposedly unmediated and thus truthful testimony. For Dubois, slave torture subordinated the extraction of information to the dramatization of who counted as citizen, who did not. Only the citizen was immunized from torture. And I would argue that this indemnification was reenacted in the suffering inflicted on the slave. The identification of the citizen's immunity to torture is reenacted in a negative body, in a body that determines the identity of the citizen through its negation, which I think is a very Hegelian moment here. And notice that Dubois kind of distanced herself from the actual torture of the slave to how the slave's torture and the slave's so-called truth-speaking is witnessed by the non-torturable. And this is important because that condition of spectatorship is endemic in the society of the spectacle, in Western heteronormative European, Eurocentric mediatic cultures, looking at famines, looking at war zones, even these days looking at the way the coronavirus is inflicting incredible class and race-based and gender-based harm in the so-called global South. So this witnessing, why is it important to witness this production of truth? That's what she's looking at. So here the body as a theatrical surface, as a scenography, comes into play as a visual artifact. It's not just the extraction of words, of voice, that's going to be transformed into logos through its transcription, through writing, but rather also the visual presentation, the visual production of truth, in much the same way that Heidegger will talk about truth as unveiling, as disclosure, right? As coming out from hiddenness into an openness, okay? And she says, of this will to truth, that there's a dominant spatial model, this is on page 76, for the approach to truth, which appears to be a descent into darkness and a reemergence into light. and I want to continue to look at this for a moment. So in her dissection of this architecture, the spatiality or the spatialization of the will to truth, privileges the interspatial passage between the visual and linguistic elements that are undoubtedly present in such a manner as to abrogate any clear demarcation between interior cognition and the topographic invasion of foreign bodies and terrains. This is what Dubois is getting at. The intervention, the intrusion into the slave's body is basically a occupation, a topographic occupation, invasion of a foreign body. And its alienness, is it being a xenos, a stranger, an alien, is crucial to its torturability. The fact is both inside and outside, and extimate, Gottman would use that vocabulary. So in reference to this juridical torture, she concludes, at another extreme of the spatial model, the one of a descent into darkness and light, is the idea of truth as hidden and buried. Seeking the truth may involve a journey, a passage through a spatial narrative, a sinking down into the past, into the interiority of memory. And I will also say the interiority of the foreign body that's being the space where truth is being mined and expropriated from. So a sinking down into the past, into the interiority of memory. The model of truth thinking is consistent with other such paradigms already suggested, where the violence of the torture is thought to be necessary to enforce production of truth from the slave. The slave's body is thus constructed as one of the sites of truth, like the underworld, the interiority of the woman's body, and the elsewhere to which truth is always slipping. This elsewhere where the truth is always slipping. Now, a theorist like Dubois, who is an expert on 5th century Greece, one of the leading experts as far as I'm concerned, also writes from a contemporary position. The opening of the book, if you remember, has her visiting a torture exhibition in Rome in the mid-1980s. So that positioning of the subject, the time, place, and subject position is never far from this type of thinking, and it's comparative. So if we think of the colonial project, the imperialist project, as exactly this project of extracting truth from foreign bodies, as a leaving of your sight, a descent, and I mean a literary descent. Foucault would call this hierarchical observation, right? Descent into an inferior body, right? Inferiorized body, into that body as a journey downward and also a journey outward into an alien site from which to extract truth. And I think this model informs a lot of truth-seeking projects to this day, a lot of projects that spectacularize foreign bodies. I think, for example, if you look at Trump's border discourse, right, around Mexican rapists and murderers and things like that, he's trying to produce a discourse of the border, the truth of the border, via these stigmatized foreign alien bodies, that he has to describe and descend into. Also, his fixation on the Chinese virus, right, his orientalization of that virus as a kind of new border demarcation he can place around these bodies, in order to place the truth of the virus outside America, outside United States public sphere, outside American behavior, outside of his own, complete maladministration of the pandemic over the last 3 months. So I'll stop here and open up for questions and interventions and comments. And I would also argue, just briefly, that when we get to Kojève and Hegel and Kojève, we'll find some of the same relationships of the master seeking its truth in the body of the other, which is seen as alien, outside of its purview, and as inferior.
There's this brilliant scene in a Fellini film where there's a black well, an African dance. I was just searching for it. I can't find it. There seems to be this moment in, you know, not just when Italian neorealism was, of course, we have some sporting events and so on, where we quite literally see a lot of what you're describing, a lot of this slave torture subordinate into like a spatialized and architecturally privileged extimate model of pleasure for dinner. In this specific moment, it was dinner goers. There's this Fellini film, it's not 8.5, where there's Italians watching this black dancer. She's an African dancer whose body is really filmed in such a way that there's a contrast between her sweat and her really fit physique and so on. You know, I think of like media examples in visual culture of this relationship that Dubois is describing. I mean, one could say it's increasingly outpouched to the terrain of athletics and so on, but I'm curious as to like contemporary examples in visual culture maybe that one would point to these relationships.
Yeah, I just put up one that is still, I think, very contemporary. Does everybody see it? I put it on screen share. Can you see this diagram? Okay.
Yes.
This is a blueprint made in 1807 of the slave ship Brooks, which was supposed to accommodate 450 odd slaves, men, women, and children, though in actual historical record transported over up to 650 slaves on many of its voyages. And I consider this a kind of early example of what John Bella is calling computational colonialism, in the sense that let's do some image work with this diagram. First thing, but does anybody want to comment on this? Maybe you guys should do some of this image work and I can listen rather than, you've heard me talk enough. I have my analysis of this, but I'm interested in yours. What you see here, just literally, is that I've blown it up as much as I can. Let me see if we can get it even bigger. It's hard to find a good copy of this. Is that there's in profile, basically this diagram gives you a viewpoint from above and a kind of X-ray vision, because it eliminates the deck of the ship. So it's looking below the decks, right? And it's 2 decks that you're seeing here, and it's showing how many slave bodies the ship can carry. What is its carrying capacity? Because obviously economic calculations involved in this. And it's giving you a kind of what Foucault would call hierarchical observation, right? And these bodies are, you know, they're cargo, you know, they're chattel, right? So but I'd be interested in people's response. Or anybody wanted to comment on the image.
I mean, I've seen this image before. I encountered it actually in a book on data visualization. So I think what you're saying about kind of this computational sort of representation, I think is sort of on point, right? It's just the way that it sort of marks or maps the body as these sort of dense kind of mathematical figures.
Yeah, there's a 0-1 relationship between the available space in the ship, which exists between the bodies and the bodies. It's a binary code in many ways.
It also, I mean, it, you know, looks like a sort of ant colony. So it I think also has the effect of making it sort of removed from figuration, perhaps sort of getting to this kind of more animal condition.
Yep, yeah, that's good. Any other comments or observations? It definitely is very insightful.
I feel like there's especially in the contemporary context of this image, right? Because like this was an image used for one purpose when it was first scrawled, and now it serves very different.
Could someone mute? Could people mute? Because I'm hearing conversations with someone else.
Well, you know what? I think it's
okay. Hope it's not you.
I think he's telling whomever to be quiet.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Go on. Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, I think like this image served maybe like a more quote utilitarian or engineering purpose when it was first drawn, but I think it circulated now with different purposes or to different utilities. And I'm just thinking, because I've seen it actually many times. It was actually my part of my Facebook cover photo at some point when I was younger. But I think like there's a certain like temptation to like empathize with the subjects of this photo, which is like problematic because the photo is literally a fantasy, and it probably was a fantasy when it was engineered, and it's a fantasy now, but it's this sort of like white liberal beckoning for us to like empathize with it, but in empathizing with this photo, we sort of indulge the perversion of the fantasy that this like photo represents, because it's not a real photo, right? And like, I don't know if this is the right word, but maybe like it's a phantasm, but it's specifically white phantasm.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the position, see what I want, as a visual culture theorist, I'm always interested in the object of what's being shown, but I'm also equally interested in the enframement, right? And the enframement is that there's this relationship between a white gaze that stands outside the space that's being displayed, that has been designed. It's a design space, right? It's a lithograph, you know, a blueprint. It was used by abolitionists to, as you said, to create empathy for slaves. But originally, it was a technical drawing of what the ship was going to do. And as I said, it did carry slaves, more slaves than this number than it shows here. So it's a completely inhumane institution. And so there's this kind of, what interested me here and related to Du Bois' discussion of the witnessing of torture, you know, where is this spectator who sees this descent into darkness, right? And to the outside to bring back, like treasure, a certain truth. And there's a dimension, well, the whole transatlantic slavery was that type of dynamic. Of course, capitalist profit modes were central to it, but certainly the production of white identity through its subjugation of Black bodies is also a part of it. And I think that this illustration really is about that, because the white spectator is not implicated, as you said, by this space. And for me, this is a space not only of showing slaves; they're not slaves really. This is a factory for the making of slaves. That the actual spatial architectural incarceration, as in Foucault's panopticon, is a way of producing a particular type of subject, or non-human, as you put it. Other comments?
Yeah, going off of what you just said, so I'm noticing how the figures are all self-similar. So like they seem to be like abstracted units of labor potential rather than human individuals.
Exactly.
And so to me, it calls to mind like the silhouette of like Le Corbusier's like modular man or something. So, but instead of trying to systematize aesthetics and architecture, it's all about, yeah, like you said, like the white gaze and labor and exploitation.
Yeah. And this is the opposite of Foucault's panopticon, whose goal was individualization. This is all about de-individualization and making, you know, as you said, this commodity artifact, this entity. But so what interests me here again is that the gaze, the master's gaze, is distantiated from a material density and has to have that position, this kind of panoramic, occupy this panoramic vision. I'm giving you some visual culture now, in order to extract truth, value, whether it's commodity, economic value, because this is about, you know, how much profit, you know, can the ship makes, because they understand the percentage of bodies on this ship that are being shown that will die on the way back from Africa. And sometimes when they were running out of food and water, they just, the profits were so enormous that they could afford to dump bodies I mean, living people, throw them overboard, and still, arrive in the United States or other countries and make a huge amount of financial profit. So, I think the same dynamic of distantiation of the master gaze from against materialities at play in Dubois' discussion of this kind of juridical torture of slaves.
Alan, in the Raft of Medusa, in Jericho's depiction sees bodies piling over, dripping into the ocean, falling off, suggesting that these bodies are making contact with the outside. Here it's quite opposite, right? These bodies are not allowed at all contact with the outside. There's a shelling almost to prevent it, a very defined exterior border, to use a term. There's something, I wish that there were sections like A, B, C to describe this better. I think it's called the bow of a ship.
There are other sections on this, yeah. There are other sections.
The front, I think that's called the bow, I don't know, but there's this triangulation. It's one of the few shapes that one can make out in almost a hierarchy, right there. Yeah, right there, there's this triangulation that suggests a hierarchy of not only our eyes follow the ship from bottom to front in whenever observing a ship from this aerial gaze, but this also suggests something of like a pinnacle.
Yeah, I think one of these sections is where women and children are stored, separate from the adult males. Yeah, you're right. I agree with you. And it actually brings to mind, Deleuze has a very interesting discussion on what he calls the outline, right? The notion of a body that's subordinated to a rigid outline, right? He says this is typical of Greek and Roman art. You call it the tactile haptical outline, right? The notion of bodies are in a particularly disciplinary frame. They have to be rigidly outlined and not allowed to break that outline. So I think it's what you're actually intersecting with in your comments, second. Other comments?
Alan, I have a question, but it's less about the graphic and more about your lecture, and
okay, sure.
basically more probably more wide-reaching about the general cause. The role of the white gaze and this relationality of, okay, the black non-human, because they aren't subject, is only constituted by its relation to the white man or white gaze, and how this relates to the mode of doing theory, of actually, okay, is this just an object? Is this an object of study of, okay, we have found that out, or does this have implication for how do we talk, how do we theorize about these objects and about this history? And because and it seems that this problematic of, okay, trying to extract truth from it. I mean, we want to find out the truth about power structures, about history, and so on. And yeah, how this theory and object, I know that these categorizations become problematic in this context, but how these relate in this overall context. I know it's a big question, but I think it's important to ask it.
That's the question for the entire course. The creepy thing about the master-slave dialectic is, and when everybody thinks they have dispensed with Hegel and surpassed him, overcome Hegel, sublated him, right, which is a Hegelian gesture anyhow. So you haven't, the minute you say you surpassed Hegel, you're being more Hegelian than Hegel, is the fact that this master-slave dialectic reappears in other forms. I just gave you an example, from the Panopticon, right? Disembodied gaze of the guard, that embodies the prisoner, right? I think, first of all, it forces our directions. It's not exhaustive, but it does force our directions to look at materiality, look at subject positioning, and to not, as I said in my introduction, not to dematerialize power. And this is one of the reasons why I was compelled to gravitate to the issue of violence, because I wanted to see the materiality, the material structures of power, and not to reduce power simply to discourse, and juridical proceduralism, right? Because there's so many cases you have a copy of my book, unpaginated. I'm sorry, that's the only way I could counterfeit it. This archive, whatever they're calling it right now, where the readings are stored. And after the introduction, the first chapter in that book is about Guantanamo tribunals, and showing how law has been falsified, and begins to collapse, that lawfare collapse into warfare. And to look at the material, one of the things I'm going to argue is that that the body is integral, embodiment and the senses are integral to what I call an infrastructure of political practice, infrastructure of historical transformation. So infrastructure studies tend to not look at bodies to a certain degree, but at artifacts, networks, of things, of inorganic matter. But I'm interested in the what do you call it again? The articulation, in the sense of the articulated lorry between organic or inorganic entities and actors in an assemblage or in a network. So, and also to tackle the problem that there is no revolution in the assemblage, right? Assemblage, it looks like there's no violence happening whatsoever. So how do we begin to approach some of these issues? So the readings will explore this dynamic and many others, Not all of this is going to be predicated on violence. Actually, the section after we finish with Hegel and Kojève next week, it's going to be looking at sexuality and phantasmagoria and the commodity fetish. All that. So there's various strands that need to be intertwined with each other, and what will come out of it is unpredictable. You can take a look at my article on cultural anesthesia. I can put that up on the website as well, which was an application of some of these issues, particularly of Lacan's mirror stage to the trial of Rodney King and to American racism. I also have an interview that I've done since then that talks about some of the contemporary issues. As you migrate from site to site, it's not really a matter of superimposing theory on empirical practices, but going into the particularity of those empirical practices. This is a kind of the ethnographic approach, right? Being very sensitive to site-specific details and realities, and then showing how they open up into wider realities. So in that book, Formations of Violence, Archives of the Insensible, there's a chapter called Traumatizing Truth Commission. I'm not sure we'll have a chance to read it. But it talks about the type of torture that was taking place in apartheid era South Africa, and basically how Isangoma, traditional healers, read these practices of the state, in which I call a kind of Africanization of Hegel. This is what I do there, kind of Africanizing of Hegel's master-slave relationship. And it reappears there. And I can't tell you why. I can't give you historical causality. There's no linearity on it. But if you look at this particular form of torture where they would burn and asphyxiate their victims, and in order to immunize, as a kind of medicinal practice to immunize their own bodies, this is how the Black South Africans read it, is a kind of reappearance of Hegel again. And so Hegel keeps on reappearing like haunting a lot of these contemporary scenarios. So it's a starting point, not an end point, but it's certainly a portal into it. And looking at the relation, I think what's really important, I think is this is Van Noon's lesson that we have to attend to, is the relationality of bodies. When people talk today about, the killing of unarmed African Americans by police who then get indemnified for their act of violence, like the recent killing of that jogger. Let's see what happens to that Texas jury, where those guys end up going to jail. The focus, of course, is justifiably on the type of representation of Blackness, this type of violence, like the killing of Trayvon Martin or the killing of Amadou Diallo, incorporate, personify, materialize, reenact. Frank Wilderson has talked about these acts as therapy for the white public. He calls it therapeutic, right? you know, in a very sarcastic, bitter way. I accept that those readings, I think they're crucial, but I'm also interested on the other side. How do these police killings reproduce whiteness? How they reproduce the master discourse? How they reproduce forms of sovereignty in miniature, right? And I have a discussion of that again, in Archives of the Insensible. I talk about the monopolization of violence, which is the seizure of violence from the commons, right? And its rarefication as the state monopolizes the uses and organs of force. And why does that need to show state monopoly of violence? Has to be dramatized and enacted through the media of the Black body. And of course, the conversion of the Black body into media, which is exactly what Fanon is discussing in The Fact of Blackness.
You know, with the Ahmaud Arbery case,
Wait,
just
Ekin, can we get
mentioned
someone else who hasn't asked a question yet?
Sure, sorry.
Sure. Anybody else have an intervention, question, problem? Something you would need me to clarify? The more you talk, the better I can adjust what I'm saying to your needs.
I was just thinking about Mbembe's concept of the becoming negro. I don't know how it's translated to English.
Yeah.
Of the world, like in at least the way I read it is as if the transfer of the modern project of like absolute spirit into the technical, the non-human technical apparatus would, in a way, make progressively more and more of the human biological bodies to be biopolitically equivalent to what in the past were specifically the non-Western, non-white colonized bodies. I wanted to like just know what's your opinion about that general like line of thoughts.
Well, I would have problems with the evolutionary dimension because, as I said, you know, my own interest, and it's already discussed extensively in Orlando Patterson's book, Slavery and Social Death, this notion of the instrumentum vocale puts slavery in relationship to technicity. So we have to think about that. And that's work that has to be done. I'm in the process of doing it. And we're going to be looking at some discussions of that in relation to Agamben's book, Uses of the Body. What Mbembe is discussing actually originates in the work of Amy Césaire, who was Fanon's teacher and close friend. Césaire basically argued at the end of World War II that the European or the Eurocentric world found the Holocaust so horrific because it was the first time that these techniques that have been historically applied to the bodies of the colonized were transferred to a European white population, right? And this is why there was such a horror. And this is where, you know, Césaire, you know, is trying to show that the global South is the truth of the West, right? Of the Western absolute spirit, right? How do we explain that? You know, the big debate around Holocaust and genocide, particularly in its industrial forms, focused on how could Western Enlightenment rationality be transmuted into the mass extermination. This is people like Zygmunt Bauman have discussed this. And then, you know, I think Mbembe and Césaire are you know, asking the same question of the colonial project. Why, you know, the colonial project is extension of Western instrumental rationality, particularly in its economic dimensions, but also in its biologization. And here I would be very careful about using the word biology, because I would argue that biology is a biopolitical concept, right? And historically, biologization of bodies has been used to institute and reify racial hierarchies. And I always have problems with Agamben, who tends to use biology interchangeably with the biological body interchangeable with bare life. I don't think they are. I think they're two separate, distinct categories. So biologization would have been part of the colonial project, the colonial apparatus of subjugation and a power knowledge apparatus to which bodies could be subordinated. It's interesting. I just was teaching a course on cultural memory and revisiting the historians debate, right? Where this was a debate of German revisionist historians who wanted to show that the German Holocaust wasn't as evil, you know, or as exceptional as it was being made out at the end of 1945, you know, onward, and then comparing it to the Gulag archipelago in Russia and similar practices in Russia. And I was going through that debate, you know, and the revisionist historians who wanted to kind of normalize or renormalize the Holocaust were saying that Germans were responding traumatically to Russian practices that they were aware of, you know, in order to combat Soviet communism, which is their arch, you know, Schmittian enemy. They had to adopt some of the same techniques. You know, so there was a kind of mimetic relation between Germany and the Russians that originates with the Russians because they were doing this earlier than the Germans. And in that entire debate, none of the historians, both Habermas, who responds to them, and some other liberal left theorists to respond to these revisionist historians, nor the revisionist historians, talk about the fact that the first concentration camps, or some of the earliest concentration camps, because there were concentration camps instituted by the British during the Boer War, where Boers, Dutch colonists, were incarcerated. But the first concentration camps, which also had a project of extermination, was instituted in what is now Namibia, German Southwest Africa, with the revolting Herero tribes and other tribes in Namibia. And this was a concentration camp, and this was like around 1904. And yet that never mentioned.
A short comment on the relation of colonization and the historical singularity of the Holocaust. One characteristic that is anti-Semitism is structurally something different than colonization and racism. They cannot be reduced to one another. They are structurally very, very different. In anti-Semitism, you fantasize about the Jew who is almighty, who controls the world, whereas in racism, this abject subject, which is not a subject, is produced. This is something completely different, and you cannot reduce the Holocaust to just another form of, okay, the same techniques as colonization.
Well, can you separate the Holocaust from German occupation and, you know, production of recruitment, conscription of slave labor of non-Jews as well as Jews, and the type of, you know, and why the, you know, a majority of the concentration camps existed outside German national borders. So I think that there's a kind of interface with colonization logics. You know, Germans were looking for Lebensraum, you know, living room, right? And since they lost their third world colonies after World War I, they decided to move east. And, you know, and we could talk about German racism, which also included Roma and Slavic people. I'm looking for, there is an interesting book that looks at the kind of transmigration, the migration of anti-Semitic tropes to the colonies in the 19th centuries. If I can.
Also, on that point, Alan, while you're searching, there's an article by this, I don't know any of his other work, but Samir Ganesha. He's at Simon Fraser University, and he has this article on the neoliberal personality. And Eric, this might be a good reference. He ends the piece with sort of an extensive discussion of, I think it's Walter Benjamin's just like analysis of anti-Semitism in the context of contemporary border discourses, particularly in the United States.
Could you send that to me?
Yeah, I'll link it right now.
I appreciate that. It sounds very interesting. So what happened in the British Empire, anyhow, the anti-Semitic discourses migrated from England and from Europe into South Asian colonies, right? And the group that was targeted with these discourses were Indian, Sri Lankan Muslims, right? So there was a whole, where is his name? I'm trying to get the book reference and the name. It's in the bibliography article I wrote. So there are connections between anti-Semitism and colonialism that need to be examined.
But they are not reducible to another, and that is incredibly important.
Not reducible to what?
They are not reducible to one another. Anti-Semitism isn't just another form of racism that is directed against another group. As I said, they are structurally very different.
Actually, to take up that point is the very interesting work of Moshe Postone, who talks about the relationship between the image or the tropology of the Jew and the Nazis and capital and the commodity fetish, right? And how they share certain attributes. And certainly then we can make some metonymies between the fact of slaveocracy, which is also about the capitalization and commodity fetishism of Black bodies. Yeah, the book I was referring to is by Amir Mufti, M-U-F-T-I, his first name is A-A-M-I-R, called Enlightenment in the Colony, the Jewish Question and the Crisis of Post-Colonial Culture. Very interesting book. You might be interested in checking that out. Because it talks about this connection between colonialism and anti-Semitism, particularly since it was applied. And to this day, you can see in India and in Sri Lanka, a lot of anti-Semitic tropology being applied to the indigenous Muslim populations in both countries. Because primarily Muslims a significant number of those Muslims in those countries are mercantile, petty merchants and things like that. So there's all sorts of money, capitalism, and also the linking of local Muslims to what is considered to be transnational Islamic capital stemming from the Gulf, right? As a kind of foreign subversion, intrusion into these domestic economies. One more question. We're over time.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in that we're a little bit over time, but I'm happy to stay for another 5 minutes or so. Yeah.
And if you have questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in class, you can email me. I'll be happy to answer all of them. We also can Zoom if you want to do advisement as well.
I do have one, but I can wait for next class.
No, one question.
Because I think I'm hearing what you're saying and this conversation you're having with Eric, and to me it seems to sort of fall back to what you were saying about spectacularization of foreign bodies, and you said something about how all these models, that there's so many truth-seeking projects that spectacularize foreign bodies, and to me it seems like colonial sort of domination is sort of based on this sort of concept of like novelty, right? Of like encountering like a new body, sort of new resources. And so it's through like that kind of novel encounter that you create this sort of spectacular being. So then what then would be sort of a kind of contemporary neoliberal process that renews that spectacularization that would render a Black body sort of still sort of novel, right? Like, doesn't it seem like the kind of the whole purpose of the globalization village is to like sort of flatten difference and create kind of homogeneous of culture? So like, what is that other process that keeps sort of renewing that fascination?
Yeah, one could raise questions which I don't have the answers to what degree the neoliberal project is imploding on itself. Accelerationist capitalists have argued some version of that, and to what degree racialization is still integral to the neoliberal project. Foucault argued that, I think, to a certain degree, and society must be defended. The distribution of populations by race, though he didn't go into the colonial situation in great depth. I wrote an essay. I can put it on. I can upload it. It came out in 2007, called "The Actuarial Gaze." Now, expanded on Rancière's globalized Rancière's notion of the police concept of history. Rancière, by the police, doesn't mean literally only the police, but all sorts of regulatory institutions like immigration control, borders, social services, public health, right, court systems and stuff like that. They're all the police for Rancière, and basically he said basically the major function of this police apparatus is to be able to put bodies in their proper places, right? Their proper locations, right? And this also, kind of communicates with this notion of the subjugated, of the oppressed, as the part with no part. The part of society that doesn't really not treated as part of society, and that opens up the possibility of the part with no part, which actually I think there's a very interesting intersection between Rancière's work and someone like Frank Wilderson and other Afro-pessimists, Jared Sexton, who basically see, the American civil society is predicated on slavocratic legacy, right? And that integration into civil society is not emancipation for the black subjects in the United States. So in this essay, it's called The Actuarial Gaze, I globalized Rancière's model of the police concept of history and the need to locate subjects in their proper place, in a proper position. And I talk about the circulation through globalization of proper bodies and the circulation of improper bodies. And in that notion of the improper body, the terrorist, the figure of the terrorist, the kind of tropology of the terrorist, occupies a kind of heuristic position at the apex under which are classified undocumented immigrants, asylum seekers, people with compromised immune systems and things like that. And that they all constitute the circulation of bad bodies, right? Negative circulation that has to be controlled at the level of the political, of sexual circulation, at the level of public health. And I adopted two figures from espionage or from Cold War theory, the notion of the mole and the notion of the sleeper body, okay? The mole and sleeper body are kind of two words for the the anti-communist discourse in the United States that Russia had planted, had trained these Russian spies to look and sound exactly like Americans and planted them as moles or sleepers in the United States. And at a certain point, they would be awakened. This is a metaphor, and destroy crucial defense facilities in the United States as part of a Russian takeover. So I think that, let's say, Trump's discourse on migrants from the South, Central and South America, takes this notion, the migrant is a sleeper mole-like body. He's going to reveal his true essence. So I think that's where I would begin. And obviously the notion of negative circulation can be seen both as an anti-globalization discourse, because we've seen the rise of autocratic nationalisms in Europe in reaction to globalization and transnational information and bodily flows, but also could be seen as integral to liberal discourse. And Agamben I quote Agamben in that essay. He says, and this is he says the notion of security, right? He distinguishes between disciplinary power, as Foucault outlined it, and securocratic power. That's a beautiful term that was coined in South Africa, the notion of securocracy or securocratics, right? He said, Agamben argued that while disciplinary power is about abolishing disorder, securocratic power has this neoliberal vocation of managing disorder. And I think we're seeing that right now in the way the pandemic is being administered, governmentalized by the Trump administration. Not abolishing disorder, but managing it. Of course, they want to manage it to save capitalism, which again is a neoliberal project. Okay, thank you for your patience. I hope more people will talk. I apologize if I talked for too long. There's a lot of material to get through. Just to remind, I don't think I specified it in the syllabus, But for next week, to read the excerpt from Hegel. Don't want to read the whole phenomenology of mind because that's a course unto itself. The independence, dependence of self-consciousness, lordship and bondage. And the introduction, or in place of the introduction, written in the introduction reading of Hegel by Korzhev, in place of an introduction, and then the chapter that follows that, chapter 2, I think. And we also can continue discussing Dubois and maybe also hopefully have time to discuss Hartman as well in the recommended reading section. So that would be the readings for next week. And if anybody has any questions about anything I discussed today, want to have a more extended discussion, just email me. We can arrange a Zoom, however you want to do it, by email or by Zoom.
Are we writing a paper at the end of it, or?
Yeah, it's Lauren, are you there still?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Isn't there a paper requirement to do?
Yeah, there is. There is
You
a
know,
paper requirement. I can get the specifications about it and bring it back next time, just so I
Yeah.
can be clear on it, if that's
It's
all
a
right.
couple of weeks after the course ends, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
3
Yeah.
weeks or something like that.
Yeah, I think you can set the date, but yeah, I'll get the specifications and bring it next time.
And we can talk about that requirement. Certainly, everybody has some very interesting projects, so it would be interesting if you can, maybe you want to introduce the projects you're working on into this final paper. But I would have the one caveat that if you could begin to read that project through some of these readings, which you may have not done to date, maybe you have, but it would be interesting, because that's what we all have in common is the syllabus, so the readings. And so to maybe think about where your project is in relationship to these readings as they begin to unfold. The other thing you can do is a paper that's completely looking internally within the readings of the syllabus and picking up common threads or oppositions or whatever. So either one would be perfectly acceptable to me. Okay, so have a good week. Stay safe wherever you are. Don't believe this reopening rhetoric. Please don't believe it. It's really there to save capitalism, nothing else. The criteria is extremely dangerous, and there's going to be a resurgence of this virus, that's going to set us back everything we did for the last 2 months, those of you who have been under lockdown. I mean, even in Germany now, which has had a very stringent testing and contact tracing system, there's been an increase in infections with the kind of modified reopenings they've done. It's also happening in Hong Kong as well, and I think Taiwan. Okay, so I'll see you here next Saturday, same time, same non-place.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Take
Have a
care.
good week.
Have a good week. Ciao.